A black janitor dreaming of becoming a pilot? That broom suits you better than the mocking laughter tore through the military storage room as Alicia Monroe was forced to bow her head. But the moment a fighter jet engine roared to life, the whole pack of mockers froze, stunned by the scene before them. From being trampled on, Alicia soared upward, delivering a fierce lesson to the world. Prejudice can bury honor, but the truth will always find its wings. The steady sound of a broom scraping across the cement floor echoed through the vast military storage room, where cold fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over rows of shelves stacked with wooden crates and equipment. Alicia Monroe moved silently down each aisle, her hands swift, sweat beading on her temples. People usually passed by without noticing her, treating her presence like part of the dust clinging to the floor. Footsteps pounded from the direction of the entrance, and soon the figures of several military police officers appeared. They made no effort to hide their disdain as their eyes landed on the black woman hunched over, sweeping. One of them jerked his chin, his voice full of command and contempt. "There, that's exactly where you belong. Keep your face to the ground and live like that." The words cut through the cold air like a sentence. Alicia lifted her head briefly, the harsh light reflecting off the metal roof flashed in eyes that once knew the open skies. But instead of replying, she bowed down again, continuing her sweeping as if she hadn't heard a thing. That made the group burst out laughing, convinced her silence was proof of cowardice. Another one chimed in, his voice so mocking it nearly stung. "I bet that Broom's smarter than you. Probably even knows the way around better than you do." Their laughter erupted, bouncing off the metal walls in a vulgar, suffocating echo. Alicia paused for a moment, her fingers gripping the broom handle so tightly they turned white. Her eyes flickered with a cold sharpness, like a blade slashing through the dark. The moment didn't last long. She lowered her head again, kept sweeping, letting them drown in the illusion that they had won. But deep in her mind, the memories of sitting in a fighter jet rushed back like a burning wind. The roar of engines, the dizzying barrel rolls, the sharp commands crackling through the radio, all of it stirred again. The broom handle trembled in her grip, though no one noticed it was the tremor of fury. The officers grew bolder. They strutted around like they owned the place, laughing and jeering. One of them nudged his buddy, sneering, "Look at her, like a rat in a hole. Bet she'll never leave the ground her whole damn life." Another round of choking laughter erupted, boots stomping the cement floor in rhythm with their They didn't care about consequences, didn't imagine that this woman had once carried a whole squadron on her shoulders, had stared death in the face, and come back. To them, Alicia was just a figure to be crushed underfoot, proof of their power. A young soldier walked past and paused. His eyes flicked from the loud group to the woman bent over the floor. Something like discomfort crossed his face, then confusion. He didn't dare step in, but he knew deep down how wrong the scene was. Alicia glanced up and caught his gaze. For a second, they looked at each other, then she turned away and kept pushing the broom forward. The laughter and mockery slowly faded as the officers left the storage room, leaving behind a void filled with silence. Alicia sat on a wooden chair by the wall and set the broom aside. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if trying to press everything down into her chest. The cold warehouse suddenly felt cramped and suffocating, as memories and reality crashing into each other. For 8 years, she had accepted living quietly, letting others think she was ordinary, enduring their scornful look. But every insult, every smug laugh, was like a small cut that added up to a deep wound. The broom handle still bore the marks of her fingernail. Alicia opened her eyes and looked at the empty space in front of her, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no longer only resignation in her gaze. It was like a calm sea hiding an undertow, waiting for a strong wind to stir it into wave. The men who had just walked out would never know what they had triggered. And even Alicia, in that moment, couldn't yet imagine that today's laughter would soon turn into wide-eyed terror when the truth rose. Inside that stifling military warehouse, where people thought she was just a shadow, the seed of a storm had taken root. And when that storm broke, it would sweep away every insult and leave behind a truth that could never be buried. That afternoon, sunlight filtered through the high warehouse window, casting light onto the cold cement floor and revealing floating specks of dust. Alicia Monroe was still in the corner, sweeping steadily, her hands moving the broom handle out of habit. The soft swish of the broom dragged on like a breath, steady but weary. Beside her sat a full metal bucket of water, catching the pale glow of the fluorescent lights. The scene resembled a dull painting of repetitive labor, where all traces of a once brilliant past lay buried under layers of grime. The warehouse door slammed open, boots hitting the cement floor with force, shaking the quiet air. A group of military police entered, their eyes immediately locking onto the thin woman bent over the ground. They exchanged smug glances and dry chuckles. Then one of them stepped forward, a sly glint in his eye. He circled around Alicia, stopping at the metal bucket beside her. With a sharp, the bucket tipped, water splashing everywhere, spreading across the floor, and soaking into his own boots. "Kneel down and clean it, you piece of trash," he growled, dragging out each word like it was meant to stab. He stomped through the spreading puddle, leaving muddy footprints behind. Laughter erupted from the others, cruel chorus rehearsed to perfection. They piled on with venomous taunt. "Look at that, perfect job for you, on your knees where you belong." Another one added, "What's the holdup? Or is that black back of yours too high to hit the floor? Alicia stared at the water in front of her, her breath sharp and shallow. She slowly bent down, her hands trembling not from fear, from rage held back. The broom handle in her grip vibrated with tension, as if it might snap. Her eyes flared for a second, fierce and wild. Then she forced them down, masking everything behind a calm facade. The sound of the disturbed water sloshing across the floor turned mocking, each drop a cruel reminder of the humiliation she had to swallow. A young soldier passed by and stopped. He saw it all, his face clouded with unease, eyebrows drawn tight, but the fear of confronting a pack of MPs held him in place. His mouth parted, then closed again. He turned away, shoulders slightly trembling, as if he'd just betrayed something sacred. Alicia caught his eye for a fleeting moment, a look filled with discomfort, trapped under the weight of silence. The laughter rolled on, louder than ever. To them, Alicia's restraint was proof of their power. "That's right, down lower. Get every last print I left," one of them shouted with glee. He kicked again, splashing more water across the floor, adding new stains. The group circled like predators, their thrill feeding off her silence. In their eyes, Alicia wasn't a person, she was a joke, something to dominate for sport. Alicia bent down, her hand touching the floor, fingertips numb from the soaked water. She wiped each streak with an old rag, her movements slow, but inside, her heart pounded like a war drum. The insults swirled around her, yet in her mind, a different sound took over: the roar of jet engines, urgent radio calls from teammates, the wind tearing through the sky. Those memories forced her to clench her jaw to keep from saying a word. That seemingly endless moment was one Alicia would etch into memory, like a warning etched in stone. Every stomp of a boot, every scornful word, drove deeper into a pride long buried. But instead of breaking it, they unintentionally awakened a strength even she had tried to forget. The officers had no idea they had planted the seed of resistance in this woman, a seed that one day would erupt force. The water spread beneath her feet, its damp scent mixing with sweat to create a stifling atmosphere. The officers, finally satisfied with their cruel show, turned and walked away, their laughter echoing like metal, scraping metal. Alicia sat on the floor, exhaled deeply, and watched as the water slowly faded into the cement. Her hands clenched so tightly that her fingernails left marks in her skin. Her eyes fixed on the doorway where light streamed in, and for a split second, quiet resolve flashed in her gaze. From a distance, the young soldier turned his head and looked back at the woman crouched in the puddle. His eyes shimmered and regret. He knew he hadn't been brave enough to act, but also knew that what he'd just witnessed would haunt him for a long time. As for Alicia, when she lifted her head, her eyes no longer showed only restraint. They gleamed like steel, hiding a storm waiting for its time to strike. In that dim warehouse, the officers' cruel show may have ended in laughter, but in truth, it was the beginning of something none of them could have predicted. And the water spilled today would become tomorrow's fire, when the past was forced to rise, and the truth could no longer be contained. The air in the cafeteria that day was thick with the smell of grease, the clattering of forks and knives on stainless trays, and the loud chatter of soldiers rushing through their meals before heading back to their shift. Alicia Monroe sat at a long table by the wall, quietly eating a cheap meal of cold meat and bland boiled vegetables. The fluorescent lights cast a gray, tired hue across her face. In front of her, a sudden spike in snickering signaled something bad was about to happen. A group of military police entered, arrogant in their stride, slamming their trays onto tables like claiming territory. One of them slapped a table hard, the bang rattling the entire room. He spoke with a sneer, making sure everyone could hear. What else do black women do besides mop floors? The words sliced through the air like a blade, turning the rowdy but harmless atmosphere suddenly tense. Cutlery froze midair, and several people glanced toward the corner where Alicia sat. She remained silent, her spoon hovering midair. The man kept going, voice dripping with mockery. Heard she used to be in the Air Force. What a joke. Look at her now. Fighter pilot eating like a janitor. His buddies burst out laughing, their howling meant to drown out every other sound in the room. Some young soldiers kept their heads down, shoveling food quickly, avoiding eye contact, their stomachs twisting. No one dared speak up, because power in this cafeteria didn't belong to reason but to fists, and those who knew how to use them. Alicia lifted her head and locked eyes with the man who had insulted her. Her voice came out raspy but firm, each word sharp and steady. Don't mistake silence for weakness. The room seemed to pause for a beat. A spoon clinked softly against a tray, and a few sitting nearby held their breath without meaning to. Then, like a crashing wave, the room erupted with whistles, table slaps, and mocking laughter. One shouted, "Don't tell me you think you can fly a jet." The whistles dragged on, blending with the laughter, turning the moment into some twisted performance where Alicia had become the lead act for their amusement. Another added, "Bet your broom can fly better than you ever could." The laughter burst out again, bouncing off the walls, harsh and sharp enough to sting the ears. Alicia set her spoon down on the tray, clasping her hands together on the table. Her eyes didn't blink, staring directly at the ones mocking her. Another brief silence crept in, and her calm unsettled a few who couldn't quite explain the chill that ran down their back. But the MPs quickly snapped back into their swagger. They stood and walked slowly toward her. One leaned in close, his breath reeking of cheap alcohol and sweat, and whispered with venom, "You know what the only thing you're good at is? Picking up our trash." The group roared with laughter, slapping each other's backs like it was the best joke of the day. Alicia remained seated, pressed, but in her eyes burned a restrained fire. She remembered the days in the cockpit, fingers gripping the control stick, the sky ablaze before her, and the enemy closing in. Bottled-up tension was not unfamiliar, just like now, except on the battlefield. Silence was preparation for action. In front of her now were men who believed they had the right to humiliate anyone, unaware that her restraint was itself a warning. The cafeteria erupted in table slaps and mocking shouts, but inside Alicia, memories quietly resurfaced. She saw her old teammates' faces, the grateful eyes of the one she pulled from gunfire, and the cheers when the squadron made it back safely. In this moment, to the lowest place, those memories became the anchor that kept her upright. She said nothing more, but her silence was no longer submission. It was a quiet declaration. She would not let these men define her worth. Another young soldier nearby gripped Trey tightly, eyes burning with outrage. He turned to the friend beside him and muttered clenched teeth, "This is too much." But his friend shook his head and signaled for silence. In that room, the voice of justice was buried under the weight of unchecked power, and only the eyes of silent witnesses remained. Eventually, the officers grew bored, returned to their seats, and hurled a few final insults on their way. The room slowly filled again with the clinking of cutlery and scattered conversation, but the air had changed. Several eyes turned toward Alicia. No one said a word, but all could sense there was something different about this woman. In her thin shoulders, in those weary eyes, was something stronger than she appeared. Alicia picked up her spoon and continued eating slowly. Each bite went down with the cold taste of steel. The noise around her faded, but within, the undercurrent swelled. Her own words, "Don't mistake silence for weakness," echoed like a reminder that the truth still slept, waiting to be awakened. And that day was drawing closer, as those who mocked clung too tightly to the illusion of power they thought they owned. When Alicia stood and placed her tray in the wash area, a few young soldiers glanced her way. No one spoke, but in their eyes was quiet respect, the kind reserved for someone who bore the weight of an entire room's ridicule and stayed standing. Her footsteps rang firm against the cement floor, blending into the cafeteria's noise, but in that moment, they sounded like the drumbeat of a coming storm. The cafeteria door closed behind Alicia, leaving inside a crowd still whispering and chuckling. They believed they had just scored a small victory, turning a woman into a joke. They had no idea that every insult they threw had been fuel poured onto a barrel already primed to explode. And when that fire ignited, it would burn more than just their words, it would blast apart the arrogance they clung to. In Alicia's mind, the cockpit returned. The engine roared again, even if only in memory. For 8 years, she had buried her true self, but the venomous laughter from today had begun to crack the shell. Her steps carried her out of that cramped room, toward the harsh red glow of late afternoon, where the sky still stretched wide, and that sky was about to witness the return of a pilot long forgotten, but never stripped of the power to fly. After the lunch filled with mocking laughter in the cafeteria, rumors about Alicia Monroe's cold response began to spread like a joke meant for entertainment. The officers, already used to turning cruelty into sport, saw it as their newest game. While Alicia returned to her daily routine, sweeping long hallways and scrubbing dirty patches of floor, a few military police gathered in a corner of the duty room, faces lit with scheming curiosity. One of them, the type who cracked his knuckles loudly, sat in front of a military computer, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. He was curious to verify the ridiculous rumor that the cleaning woman had some connection to the air. With just a few searches, he stumbled onto data long buried in the old personnel system. His eyes froze at a faint line deep in the record, U.S. Air Force, pilot. His heart skipped a beat. Then he quickly twisted that surprise into fresh material for mockery. "You've got to see this. Unreal." He growled through a grin, yanking out a thin file and holding it up for the others. They swarmed in, squinting at the faded lines, then burst into laughter. That afternoon, in the cramped duty room, they made sure others were present to stage a public humiliation. He slammed the file onto the table, the slap of paper against wood slicing the air. "Here, a fighter pilot? Now go mop my floor," he shouted, gleeful. The others howled with laughter, each burst like a punch thrown into the room. One sneered, "Bet her plane came from the toy aisle." Another added, "Maybe a pilot in a video game, because in real life she's just good with a mop." Alicia was wiping down a nearby table. She slowly turned her head toward them. Her face was calm, her gaze cold as steel. She didn't snatch the file or try to explain. Instead, her low, gravelly voice rang out, loud enough for the whole room. "There are things you'll never understand." No tremor, no hesitation, each word like a stone dropped onto rippling water, and the room fell briefly silent. That silence lasted only a moment before laughter roared back, louder and more vicious, as if trying to smother the weight of her words. One man shouted, voice thick with spite, "Oh, we understand. Understand that you're nothing." That cry was the signal for the others to fire off more insult. "Yeah, what kind of pilot ends up a maid? If you were ever really in the Air Force, they must have kicked you out for being useless." Another chimed in, "The only thing you know how to steer is that broom." The laughter, the banging on tables, the whistles, all of it crashed together into a storm of contempt. Alicia stood tall, her eyes fixed on the file left carelessly on the table. Those faded lines were not traces of the past, proof of a life that had been twisted by prejudice. For 8 years, she had accepted silence, accepted being looked down on. But in this moment, the humiliation cut deeper than ever. In her mind, the familiar sound of jet engines roared, the urgent call to take off, and the image of endless white cloud fields she once tore through. It all surged forward, crashing against a brutal present. In the corner of the room, a young soldier sat quietly, watching. His eyes were locked on Alicia, then shifted to the laughing officers. His face flushed red, fists clenched. He wanted to speak, to step in and stop it, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by fear. He knew that even a single word of protest would make him the next target. The silence grew heavier, and his gaze dropped, weighed down by helplessness. The officers weren't finished. One of them picked up the file and waved it in front of Alicia like bait. "Hey, fighter pilot," he stressed every word, "show me how you take off, or is all you know how to do keeping your head down and mopping floors?" Laughter erupted again, harsher this time, hail pounding against dignity. Alicia didn't lash out, but her gaze made a few of them. It wasn't the look of someone defeated, it was the look of someone who had stared death in the face and led others through fire. It ended only when the officers, tired of their own joke, walked off, leaving behind a room heavy with silence. The file remained, its edges bent and worn. Alicia stepped forward, picked it up, her fingers brushing the faded, as if reaching for a part of her life buried too long. She let out a soft breath, folded the file, set it aside, and returned to her daily task. On the surface, she was still the quiet janitor, but inside, a fire had been lit, burning steadily toward eruption. That moment, small as it seemed, was the first step in a chain of events that would change everything. Because when the past is dug up as a joke, it also becomes the moment the truth begins to rise. And this truth, once exposed to light, would leave no one laughing. That afternoon, in the unit's large meeting room, the tense atmosphere brought on by a training schedule twisted suddenly into a joke when the name Alicia Monroe came up. The commander, a white man with eyes as cold as blades, scanned the list of pilots scheduled for the next day's simulation. One name had been crossed out, a young pilot recently hospitalized after a training accident. Silence hung for a moment, then he gave a dry, flat chuckle, loud enough for all to hear. "Short one for the simulator. Let the janitor try." The words dropped like casual amusement, carried enough weight to blow the room wide open with laughter and gleeful cheers. A loud roar followed. A group of military police pounded on the table, shouting in unison, "Yeah, let her take the seat." The noise crashed into the walls, transforming the serious tone of the briefing into a circus. Some stayed quiet, glancing awkwardly at each other, but no one dared speak up. Eyes flicked toward Alicia, sitting in the corner, still in her faded janitor uniform, hands resting lightly on her knees, eyes cast to the floor. A tall officer stepped closer, dragging his chair near, then leaned down to whisper in Alicia's ear, loud enough for many to hear, "If you dare sit in that seat, we'll record it and give the world something to laugh at. Let's see what kind of pilot ends up." Pathetic. The stench of cigarettes laced his breath, making it more repulsive, and the laughter of his friends echoed the humiliation. Phones hidden under the table were already recording, and a few eyes lit up with sick delight at the thought of spreading the moment across social media as the next big joke. Alicia slowly raised her head, her deep brown eyes locking coldly on the man who had just challenged. For a second, the laughter stuttered to a halt. Her voice came out low and raspy, sharp as a freshly honed blade. "Be careful what you wish for." The short sentence, each word delivered with weight, sent a chill through the room. The officers burst out laughing again, trying to drown their unease with whistles, but the flicker of hesitation in their eyes was clear. The commander crossed his arms, watching like an audience member at a show he had orchestrated. He shrugged and smirked. "Fine, give her a shot. We could all use the entertainment." Whispering spread across the room. Some young officers exchanged glances, eyes filled with doubt. Few pressed their lips together, uneasy about the cruelty in the order just given, but the majority saw only the joke. The mockery spread like a virus, infecting the room, and Alicia stood at the center, the target of every sneer and every poisonous word. In that moment, 8 years of buried memory surged back into Alicia. She remembered those early squad meetings, when every glance aimed her way was laced with doubt, when the whispers behind her back were no different than today's. The only difference was that, then, she wore a pilot's uniform. Now, All she had was a broom and janitor's clothes. Today's humiliation was simply an extension of the same old prejudice, the kind that career but never touched the core of who she truly was. The meeting room buzzed with laughter and shuffling chairs. Training plans had morphed into a sideshow, with some looking forward to tomorrow's spectacle like a comedy performance. "Let's see if she crashes or sets the simulator on fire," one voice said, laced with cruelty. Another chimed in, "That simulator's probably smarter than She Island." The laughter swelled again, this time joined by applause, as if Alicia had been officially thrown into the ring for ridicule. Alicia remained seated, neither laughing nor defending herself. Her eyes were sharp and cold, cutting through the smug faces around her. Every laugh now sounded to her like a warning siren, signaling the formation of a storm they didn't yet see coming. What she had said earlier wasn't just a retort, it was a warning, a blade hidden, waiting for the right time to strike. Outside the window, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting a red haze that darkened the room in unease. A young officer, silent throughout the meeting, leaned forward and watched Alicia. What he saw in her wasn't fear, it was something far more dangerous, something the others were too blind to recognize. He understood that the farce they were planning might become a collapse they never expected. The meeting ended in noise, the officers leaving while laughing and plotting the spectacle they hoped to witness, a janitor fumbling in a pilot's seat. They promised to show up, record it, and spread the clip like a trophy of shame. Laughter lingered even after the doors slammed shut. Alicia rose slowly, picked up the cleaning cloth left on the table, her eyes fixed on the space ahead. She said nothing more, but each step she took echoed heavy and steady, like the beat of a war drum. That night, Alicia returned to the small room she had lived in for 8 years. It held only a worn bed, a wooden cabinet, and a faded photo frame. She sat down and opened a drawer. Inside was an old, bent Air Force insignia. Her fingers brushed over it, her gaze darkening. She remembered every mission, every handshake from her squadmate, every explosion that lit up the sky. What she thought was buried had now been unearthed by a single mocking order. "Careful what you wish for," she repeated to herself, this time not as a warning to them, but to herself, because she knew that tomorrow, the joke tried to stage would become a reckoning, and those who were used to standing above others would finally be forced to face a truth they never saw. That morning, the sun blazed down on the wide airfield, streaks of light spreading across the cracked, dry concrete. Wind howled between the hangars, carrying the scent of metal, jet fuel, and dust. Alicia Monroe was escorted out, her steps steady but heavy, each one dragging the weight of 8 buried years. Ahead, a faded fighter jet sat still, its long wings reflecting the harsh sunlight. The chipped paint and fine scratches along the fuselage told stories of flights long past, of a machine that once tore through the sky in missions no one remembered. Now, it was nothing more than a cold shell, wheeled out to serve as the backdrop for mockery. A cluster of military police stood nearby, murmurs of laughter passing between them, their eyes locked on the woman in worn janitor's clothes. One of them sneered, voice stretched contempt, "Bet you don't even know how to open the cockpit." Laughter exploded, whistles followed, and boots stomped the concrete to add insult to noise. They didn't see Alicia as a person, only as the opening act to their planned humiliation. Alicia stopped in front of the aircraft's nose, her shadow cast across the dull metal. She looked up, eyes fixed on the sunlit reflection on the cockpit glass. For a moment, the noise around her faded, replaced by the distant echo of memory. She placed her calloused hand on the cold fuselage, fingers tracing along an old scratch. Images came flooding back her hand, gripping the control stick, the scent of fuel laced with adrenaline, the spins and dives that played out like a gamble between life and death. It all returned, but in a twisted shape, glory repurposed for disgrace. Another man couldn't help himself, shouting gleefully, voice sharp and taunting, "You shaking yet?" A cry cut through her memory like a blade, snapping Alicia back to the present. The crowd joined in, laughter spreading and turning the airfield into a coliseum of contempt. Alicia turned her head and glanced at them. In her deep brown eyes, something cold flashed like a still lake suddenly struck by wind. She said nothing, simply stepped toward the steel staircase beside the jet. Her footsteps rang against the metal steps, steady and deliberate, each one like the beat of a slow, heavy drum. The officers were still shouting. One yelled, "Go on, then slide back down so we can laugh." Another added, "Watch your step, mighty pilot, don't break your neck." Laughter exploded again, loud enough to drown out the wind. But in Alicia's stride, there was no hesitation. Each step lifted her higher, closer to the cockpit that had once been her world, closer to a truth none of them were ready to face. As her hand gripped the cold steel railing, for a brief moment, Alicia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The laughter, the jeers, the stomping boots, all of it faded, replaced by the roaring engines in her memory. She remembered remembered the first time she sat in the cockpit, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst as the plane lifted off. She remembered the panic of her first dog, the endless nights in the sky with nothing but the blinking red lights of the control panel. For 8 years, she had forced those memories into the deepest corner of her mind, but now, just by touching the aircraft, they surged back to life. Alicia opened her eyes and kept climbing, letting the insults crash against her back. When she reached the final step, she paused and looked down. The officers craned their necks upward, faces full of smug anticipation. They believed the greatest moment of humiliation was seconds away, that they were about to witness a farce worth laughing at for days. But in Alicia's eyes, there was no fear, no panic, only the terrifying calm of someone who had faced death dozens of times and returned. She placed her hand on the cockpit latch, feeling every small vibration as the metal warmed under the Sunday. Crowd kept yelling taunts, but their tone began to just slightly, as if instinct warned them this spectacle might not unfold as planned. A sliver of silence slipped between the noise, and in that space, Alicia smiled, a faint smile no one could read, but enough to send a chill down a few spines. The cockpit door creaked open, the sound ringing out like a signal bell. Alicia stepped inside, her small frame disappearing into the steel body of the jet. The officers fell silent for a beat, then burst into laughter again, trying to drown their unease with volume. What they didn't know was that the moment Alicia stepped into they had accidentally dragged 8 years of buried truth into the light. And once that truth rose, it wouldn't just silence them, it would force the world to look again. Inside the cramped cockpit, sunlight poured through the glass canopy, lighting up the dust-covered control panel. Alicia Monroe sat upright, both hands steady on the stick, the familiar sensation rushing back like a current through her veins. Her fingers glided across the switches, touching each component instinctively, as if 8 years had never passed. Outside, the crowd of officers remained huddled near the fuselage, their eyes eager, expectant. One of them let out a loud laugh and shouted, "Get ready to watch that jet fall apart in her hands." The laughter followed like a wave, spreading across the airfield, bouncing back in sharp, mocking echoes. Alicia drew in a deep breath, her chest rising and falling in that brief moment. She closed her eyes, letting the jeers and stomping fade into the hiss of wind in her memory. The old missions flooded back, radio chatter mixed with teammates yelling, the scent of burning powder and scorched metal. All of it came together, filling the stifling silence inside the cockpit. When she opened her eyes again, they glowed with the same steady fire that had once carried her through skies laced with gunfire. She leaned forward and flipped the main switch. A loud click echoed, followed by the low, rising rumble deep within the engine. The roar began as a low growl, like a beast waking after years of slumber, then climbed quickly, howling. The concrete under the officers' boots vibrated in rhythm, tremors spreading as if the earth itself was breathing with the engine. Smirks froze mid-laugh, some faces went pale, eyes wide with disbelief. One of them swallowed hard, his voice dry and cracking. "What the hell? The jet's actually starting." The engine's roar grew louder, a wave of hot air blasting back, kicking up dust and grit, making some cough and shield their faces. A few stumbled backward, while others forced nervous smile. "No way, it must have just booted itself," one man shouted, voice breaking under the howling wind. But deep in their chests, fear had taken root. They knew no outsider could casually bring a long-grounded fighter jet to life with just a few movements. Alicia sat still, hands gripping the stick. The roar shook her muscles tense, not fear, but from the collision of memory and reality. She exhaled slowly, her voice low and rough, yet each word clearly through the engine's growl. "Just like the last time, still mine." It wasn't a whisper to herself. It was a declaration, a hammer blow to every laugh outside. The officers glanced at one another, unease in their eyes, a chill crawling down their spine. The one who had laughed loudest now stood silent, sweat on his brow, eyes fixed on the spinning turbine. The scene that had started as a joke had turned into something else entirely, a nightmare. What was supposed to be a humiliating performance had become a stage where they were now the stunned audience to a truth about to explode. The concrete beneath them no longer felt stable, but like the heartbeat of a beast rising after 8 years in chains. A young soldier stood at a distance, eyes wide with awe. He noticed the difference in every one of Alicia's movements, in the look she gave the control panel when her fingers touched it. This wasn't clumsy play acting from someone dragged out to be mocked. This was the precision of someone who had lived her life in the cockpit. He thought silently, "She's not pretending. She's a real pilot." But he didn't dare speak the words, afraid that even a single sentence could make him the next target for the officers. Alicia tightened her grip on the stick, her body lightly swaying with the rhythm of the engine. Outside, the laughter began to fade, replaced by murmurs of unease. One of them tried to save face, shouting over the noise, "Just because it started doesn't mean she won't crash it in a minute." But the words rang hollow, even to him. In the roar of the engine, in the rush of heat sweeping across the tarmac, everyone there knew the woman they had called a janitor now controlled something none of them dared. Sweat rolled down Alicia's temple, but her eyes burned bright. 8 years of being pushed down, dismissed, forgotten now condensed into this one moment. She didn't need to prove anything with words. The sound of the engine alone was enough to erase every insult. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from pride awakened. She knew this was only the beginning, and once the wheels were in motion, nothing would stop the truth from taking flight. The airfield swirled with dust, harsh light reflecting off the canopy glass, hiding Alicia's face. From below, the crowd saw only her silhouette, seated steady in the cockpit, like she belonged there because she did. In their eyes, the moment was too much to take. The woman they had believed would never be more than a cleaning shadow was now calling life into the massive steel beast. No one laughed anymore. Only the engine screamed, ripping through the silence, announcing something no one had dared to imagine. The engine's roar surged, so powerful it shook the air itself. A blast of hot wind kicked up sand and debris, scattering loose papers across the tarmac and forcing people to shield their eyes. Alicia Monroe gripped the control stick, her hand moving with absolute certainty. The turbine spun fast, the frame shuddered, then suddenly the fighter jet shot into the sky, a piercing shock tearing through the atmosphere. In a flash, the fated body of the steel beast became a streak of light slicing into the deep blue. The officers craned their neck, faces frozen, their earlier grins cracking like fractured mask. One of them let out a choked gasp, voice trembling. "No way. She actually knows how to fly." The others stammered, eyes wide, fingers clenching instinctively. They no longer saw a timid janitor, they were staring at a true pilot, commanding the fighter jet with a mastery that made even the sky seem to bow. The aircraft tilted, then executed a perfect barrel roll, a clean arc carved across the sky under the harsh sunlight. Every movement was precise, smooth, as if etched into the heavens. Below, young soldiers burst into cheers. The roar of excitement spread like crashing waves. "She's really a pilot. My God, she's the real deal." They jumped, clapped, their voices hoarse but unrelenting, pouring out shock and admiration. Meanwhile, the officers stood frozen, unable to speak. All plans to film a spectacle of failure had vanished. Their phones, trembling in their hands, captured the opposite, an upside-down reality where the woman they had mocked now drew arcs in the sky with a fighter jet, turning ridicule into a display that left everyone breathless. Moments ago, they screamed to expose Alicia's weakness. Now, they stood silent, crushed beneath the weight of the Inside the cockpit, Alicia's eyes were razor-sharp, every muscle tensed with the engine's vibration. Her voice rang out over the comms, echoing across the base like a vow. "I once led squadrons through combat zone. You think a broom defines me?" The words hit the ground like a blade, slicing through layers of false pride. The officers lowered their heads, shoulders trembling, trying to hide from their own stunned reflection. The jet continued to loop, then plunged in a dive that made hearts below clench. Just when it seemed it might crash, Alicia pulled the stick. The aircraft tilted hard and soared back up with flawless precision. The soldiers below erupted in thunderous applause, the sound rolling across the airfield. No one held back. They knew they had witnessed something beyond belief. A woman humiliated and made into a joke had just proven, without a word, that she was, and still is, a combat pilot in every sense. Amid the cheers, a few eyes turned toward the officer, smirking with quiet irony. The ones who had tried to shame her now stood forced to bow before the truth. They stood frozen in a silent no more jokes, no pounding fists on tables. Fear clung to their eyes, and the harsh truth became undeniable. The insults they had once hurled now looked like cheap, pitiful noise, crushed completely by Alicia's actions. Above them, the fighter jet soared forward, like an arrow shot from the past, piercing through the veil of prejudice. Alicia felt every gust of wind, every scream of the engine, every beat of her heart sinking with the hum of the aircraft. In that moment, she was no longer the janitor they had mocked. She was her truest self, the one the sky had once called by name. As the plane circled back to prepare for landing, every face tilted upward glowed with awe. Below, young soldiers clapped non-stop, their shouts carrying all the way to the end of the runway. The officers remained completely silent, their faces pale, exchanging helpless glances as if searching for a way out. But there was no escape, because everything had been made clear up in the sky. And once the truth is exposed, no one has the power to bury it again. The wheels touched down on the runway, dust rising as the roar of the engine began to fade. Alicia sat still in the cockpit, eyes half closed, drawing in a deep breath. When the canopy opened and the hot wind rushed in, she raised her head, gaze quiet as it swept over the crowd below. The silence weighed heavily on the officer's shoulders, while cheers still erupted from the young soldier. That contrast was its own kind of verdict, a sentence written not in a courtroom, across the sky itself. In that moment, Alicia knew she had reclaimed not just the truth, but the pride buried for 8 long years. And those who once mocked her now had nothing left to do but bow their heads in bitter silence. Right after the flawless landing, shockwaves spread through the entire base. An internal report was sent out at emergency speed, a brief line of text powerful enough to shake every meeting room. The janitor is a former fighter pilot. That cold sentence was no longer rumor or cheap mockery. It was a truth, proven by the sky itself and witnessed by dozens. Senior officers read the report, eyes flashing with disbelief, because what had just happened tore through the silence they believed would forever hide that woman's past. In the duty barracks, the officers who once mocked Alicia Monroe couldn't sit still. The engine's roar echoed in their memory, choking their breath like an invisible sentence hanging above them. One man pressed his lips together, hands trembling beneath the table, eyes locked on nothing. Another tried to look away, but the more he hid, the clearer the shame became on his face. They remembered every insult, every sneer, and now all of it had come back like a whip lashing straight at their hollow pride. Someone tried to open his mouth and blame the situation, but the glance from one of the younger soldiers silenced him instantly. That silence carried more weight than any accusation. The room was thick with it, broken only by the heavy breathing of those realizing just how wrong they had been. They had once believed a broom could define a person's worth, but the truth was plain: they were the disgraceful one, having used power to bury talent and pride. Outside, around the airstrip, young soldiers gathered in groups, eyes lit with pride. They spoke of Alicia like a living legend, a story that had exploded before their eyes. The tale spread fast, each retelling adding new color, making her the center of admiration. "She really did lead squadrons through combat," one confirmed. "No way you mistake flying like that. I've never seen anyone handle a jet that smoothly." The story snowballed, spreading far beyond control. In a small room, Alicia sat alone, eyes quietly watching the endless stretch of runway. She knew the report had officially exposed the truth, and there was no going back. But instead of fear, she felt release. 8 years buried, 8 years of enduring, now all of it had burst open in a single moment. She no longer needed to explain herself. The sky had spoken for her, and the hundreds of eyes that witnessed it were proof no one could deny. In the hearts of those who had mocked, shame rooted deep, forcing them to lower their head. They couldn't meet her gaze anymore, and no excuse could cover the truth. Every laugh they once roared now echoed like a ghost, a reminder that their blind arrogance had made them pitiful. And as the evening sun cast gold over the fated jet, everyone understood a new chapter had begun, one where the truth would pushing this reckoning forward until justice was finally named. The fighter jet slid down the runway at decreasing speed, its wheels grinding against the concrete in a long, sharp screech before halting in a thin cloud of dust. As the engine's roar slowed, the entire airfield sank into an oddly gentle silence, not violent, but still powerful enough to shake those standing below. Alicia Monroe opened the cockpit and stepped out with calm composure, her movements slow but steady, as if she had just landed from an ordinary flight. Her face was serene, eyes cold but unmoved by the stunned stares surrounding her. To the young soldiers, that image burned into memory, a vivid proof that the truth had just come alive before their eyes. The military police prepared jokes now stood silent, their faces twisted in awkward discomfort. They huddled in small groups, avoiding Alicia's gaze, as if it were a blade sweeping across. They once believed they were in control, but within minutes, the entire farce had collapsed. The woman they mocked and belittled had become living proof of an undeniable truth. Silence settled heavier than any shout, like a verdict hanging above their heads. The commander, the one who had casually issued the mocking order, stepped forward. His face was flushed, unclear if from rage or embarrassment. His voice came out tense, as if masking a tremble. "Who are you?" The question dropped into the space like a stone hitting still water. All eyes turned to Alicia, waiting to see if she would bow her head or fall silent as she had for years. But Alicia raised her chin, eyes unblinking, and replied clearly, each word slicing through the air. "The one you looked down on for 8 years." The answer sent a shock through the airfield. It wasn't an introduction, it was an indictment of everyone standing there. It stripped away prejudice, stripped away the joke, exposed the reality that for years, these people had lived in smug ignorance, trampling someone who had once stood at the top. The young soldiers heard her words, their hearts stirred, and many couldn't help but slap their hands together in applause. The clapping started scattered, then burst into a roar. They cheered as if witnessing a victory, a turning point none of them would ever forget. The police turned pale, none daring to face the truth. One stared at his shoes, another swallowed hard, and a few dropped their phones with shaking hands. Shame covered their faces, revealing the weakness they had hidden behind laughter. The commander stood frozen, eyes dark, with nothing left to say. He knew one sentence from Alicia had just shattered the order he thought he controlled. Alicia didn't walk away immediately. She let the silence press in deeper, letting each person fully absorb the weight of her words. Then she turned and walked off, her steps unhurried but resolute, leaving behind a space where each one had to confront their own disgrace. In that moment, the truth was no longer buried. It stood clear in every stare, every heart, and nothing could erase it again. On the airfield that day, among the crowd of young soldiers still bursting with awe over Alicia Monroe's display, one soldier quietly held up his phone. He had started recording the moment the fighter jet's engine roared to life, keeping his hand steady as the aircraft shot into the sky, looped, and dove in front of their stunned eyes. That tiny lens captured every second, every cheer, every pale face among the military police. When Alicia landed, her composed posture framed the closing shot, completing a long yet undeniable piece of evidence. The soldier stared at the screen, his hands trembling, knowing he was holding something far more than a memory. It was the spark to a storm. Just hours later, the video surfaced online, first in a small group chat among soldiers, then spreading outward. Within a night, thousands of views became hundreds of thousands, then millions. People gave it a title both ironic and intriguing: Janitor or Fighter Pilot. The words on screen stopped anyone who scrolled past. A janitor and a fighter pilot, two images worlds apart, were now placed side by side to pose a question everyone wanted answered. The video opened with Alicia climbing into the cockpit as mocking jeers echoed in the background, every contemptuous word clearly audible. But within seconds, the scene flipped as the engine ignited, the plane took off, and performed a breathtaking loop. The cheers of the soldiers, the gasps from those who had mocked her, all captured with nothing edited out. In the final shot, when Alicia landed and delivered her cutting line, "The one you looked down on for 8 years," it hit like a full stop that left viewers stunned. Just a few minutes long, but powerful enough to demand instant sharing. Social media exploded. Beneath the clip, comments poured in short, furious, admiring. "This is real strength," one person wrote. "How could they let a hero mop floors for all those years?" Another asked. Hashtags attached to the video spread like wildfire, igniting heated debates, some condemning the system, others praising Alicia's resilience. The question, janitor or fighter pilot, became a challenge aimed at society itself, forcing everyone to confront the biases they had long accepted as normal. On international forums, the clip was quickly translated, and subtitles were added in multiple languages. Alicia, a woman few had ever heard of, suddenly appeared on screens everywhere: phones, laptops, news feeds. Online news outlets picked up the story, running headlines that grabbed attention: "The mysterious janitor who silenced a military base," or "8 years of silence, one flight changed everything." The force of the truth this time was unstoppable, and once it had surfaced, it swept away every excuse in its path. Inside the barracks, young soldiers were filled with both pride and unease. They whispered to each other that the situation was no longer in the hands of those who once mocked Alicia, because the whole world had seen it. A few low-ranking officers realized disaster was coming, but it was already too late. Clip was now undeniable evidence, a declaration louder than any formal accusation. And in the shadows, Alicia sat quietly in her small room, knowing the spark had been lit, and from this moment on, everything would change forever. In just one night, the video spread at an unprecedented speed, its views jumping from hundreds of thousands to millions, turning Alicia Monroe from a nameless figure in the base into the center of global attention. Social media was flooded with the hashtag number #PilotJanitor, appearing across every platform: Twitter and TikTok to Instagram. Screenshots from the video, her steady posture, and the jet looping overhead were shared endlessly. People were drawn to the haunting contrast: a janitor under contempt, and, at the same time, a battle-hardened fighter pilot. Questions flooded in. How could a pilot end up like this? Why was she forced into silence for 8 years? Under each post, angry comments surged like waves. One person wrote, "If this is true, then we're living in a system built on injustice." Another replied, "You don't bury a hero and humiliate her. Someone owes her an explanation." Long analytical threads appeared, with veterans chiming in, confirming every detail: that Alicia's actions couldn't be faked, that such precision could only come from thousands of hours in the air. They recalled a black female pilot in their squadron, someone who had led them out of an ambush, and they were certain it was Alicia. Netizens didn't stop at shock. The outrage grew, transforming into a public demand for answers. Countless new hashtags surfaced: number justice for Alicia, number expose the truth, calls for an independent investigation. Major accounts, from journalists to politicians, reshared the video with demands for justice, turning the story from a viral sensation into a full-blown social movement. Some posts read, "A nation that calls itself just can't let this happen," or "No talent deserves to be crushed just because of skin color or gender." On international forums, the video became a central topic, drawing tens of thousands of comments within hours. People analyzed every frame, from Alicia's focused eyes as she powered up the aircraft to the stunned faces of the guards below. That contrast became living proof of prejudice and how it was shattered in an instant. News channels were forced to respond, running bold headlines across homepages: "Number Pilot Janitor Sparks Global Firestorm," or "The Janitor Pilot Story Shaking the System." Inside the barracks, the atmosphere turned suffocating. Senior officers leaders were fully aware that pressure from the outside was closing in, because this was no longer an internal matter. Every decision to remain silent or to cover things up was now scrutinized under the spotlight of public opinion. The officers who once mocked Alicia feared that every word, every action they had taken would be dug up and spread online. Fear wasn't baseless. Clips from the video clearly showed their faces, their voices, and their contemptuous expression. The online community began identifying them, demanding names, and calling for serious consequence. Meanwhile, Alicia sat quietly in her cramped room, listening to her phone vibrate non-stop with messages and calls flooding in. She knew the storm had moved beyond anyone's control, and that the truth could no longer be undone. But instead of fear, she felt an odd sense of calm. Every wound, every humiliation she had swallowed over the past 8 years had now been exposed, and public outcry would speak louder than she ever could. The sky that day didn't just prove her skill, it affirmed the worth of someone who could never be defined by a mop or a janitor's uniform. In every click, every comment, every rising hashtag, the internet demanded answers. They wanted to know how a fighter pilot ended up in the shadows, why the system allowed prejudice and abuse of power to crush a person so thoroughly. And as that wave spilled beyond digital borders, it swept away every excuse, leaving only one demand behind: justice for Alicia Monroe. The next morning, before the sun was high, social media platforms were already flooded with posts about Alicia Monroe. On Twitter, the phrase "forgotten hero" appeared as a hashtag in countless, climbing to the top of trending lists within hours. TikTok was overrun with short clips from the video, where people slowed down moments of Alicia piloting the aircraft. Focused, calm expression, a stark contrast to the chaos below. These clips were set to epic music, text flashing across the screen: a janitor or a pilot, a slogan that sparked both outrage and admiration in equal measure. Comments poured in, many of them deeply emotional. "This is the image of someone buried by prejudice, but still holding on to strength," one user wrote. Another added, "We turned our backs on someone who once risked her life for our skies." The viral spread didn't stop at praise, but erupted into broader debates on racism, gender bias, and the military's treatment of veterans. Some edited videos compared scenes of Alicia mopping floors with her piloting a fighter jet, the side-by-side visuals haunting enough to send chills through millions of viewers. Amid the flood of comments, many veterans spoke up, lending even more weight truth. A middle-aged man appeared in one video, eyes red as he recalled old memories. "She saved my life during a mission. Without Alicia, I wouldn't have made it back to see my family." That testimony was instantly shared hundreds of thousands of times, transforming Alicia from a figure of controversy into a hero, validated by those who had once flown beside her. Other veterans followed, posting similar stories, describing how Alicia once led their squad out of death, flying through gunfire to shield her team. The online community listened and amplified, each personal account forming a piece of a larger picture: a woman abandoned by the system but never stripped of courage. Long-form posts emerged, analyzing the military's silence in contrast to the raw honesty of former comrades. Heated discussions spilled over from social media onto television, as news channels invited veterans to speak on air, recounting every detail that left audiences speechless. At the same time, artists and celebrities joined the movement, reposting the video with captions like, "Heroes must not be forgotten." Each of their shares brought millions more to the story, turning Alicia into a global symbol overnight. She was no longer just a character in a viral, but a representative of all those who had ever been hidden, abandoned, or buried beneath layers of prejudice. Amid the comments, there was not only outrage but also a spark of renewed belief. People wrote that Alicia's story reminded them that the truth can be buried, but it never disappears. Young people, especially young women of color, shared how they saw hope and pride in watching Alicia rise from contempt to assert her true worth. The hashtag "forgotten hero" was no longer just a call for justice, but a shared vow from millions that they would never let justice be silenced again. Public pressure mounted by the hour, with hashtags flooding not only social media but also spilling into mainstream media. Major news outlets repeatedly aired clips from the video, showing Alicia Monroe in the cockpit over and over, accompanied by sharp commentary from journalists and analysts. They asked direct questions: why a combat pilot, who once helped defend the country, was pushed into a menial role, made the subject of mockery, right on a military base. The public rejected silence, demanding clear answers and accountability for those who participated in humiliating Alicia. Inside the base, the atmosphere grew suffocatingly tense. The military police who had mocked Alicia now dodged every interview, avoiding the camera. When caught, they pressed their lips, offered no response, and hurried away with their heads down. Clumsy silence only fueled the fire, intensifying public anger. Comments poured in under clips, showing their evasions, mocking, "Heroes hold their heads high, cowards look at the ground." Contrast made their image more laughable than ever. Within the military, confusion spread among the officers. Emergency meetings were held to find ways to contain the situation, but every effort to delay or obscure the truth collapsed quickly as social media kept uncovering more evidence. Veterans spoke out, journalists dug deeper, and the public kept demanding answers. Every slow reaction, every evasive reply from the military police was picked apart, ridiculed, and turned into a meme. Satirical images spread everywhere, pairing their faces with shameful captions, making them the new targets of mockery. Online communities organized small protest campaigns outside the base gates, holding banners that read, "Justice for Alicia" and "No More Lies." Live streams attracted tens of thousands of viewers, putting the military police further on the defensive. The officers who once believed this could be buried now had to face the reality that the truth was beyond their control. Some news outlets published leaked internal documents, confirming Alicia was indeed a decorated former combat pilot. This only deepened the public's fury and turned the military police's silence into undeniable proof of complicity in injustice. In the days that followed, the military police's awkwardness became a familiar subject of mockery. Clips showing them trying to dodge crowds of reporters, covering their faces with their hands, or hurrying away, were edited into short videos with satirical music and shared millions of times. People laughed at how those who once loudly humiliated a woman now couldn't manage a single word of explanation. This humiliation went far beyond what Alicia had endured, reversing the roles and forcing those who once mocked her to feel the sting of public judgment. Alicia, in the eye of the storm, remained silent. She didn't need to speak, because the crowd had become her loudest voice. In the eyes of millions, she was now seen as a symbol of resilience, while the military police were reduced to nothing more than an image of confusion, weakness, and ridicule. The pressure didn't ease. It kept building, pressing in, waiting for the moment it would erupt into a formal investigation, one that justice could no longer escape. As public outrage continued to rise, international media quickly picked up the story, with bold headlines appearing on the front pages of major outlets. The BBC published a shocking article titled, "Black Female Fighter Pilot Now a Janitor." The piece opened with an image of the fated fighter jet taking off the day before, and Alicia Monroe's composed face as she stepped onto the runway. The author emphasized that this was not an isolated incident, but a symbol of long-standing injustice. They argued that a pilot who once served her country being forced to hide her identity and accept a degrading job just to survive was a clear failure to protect those who once protected the nation. The article spread rapidly, drawing millions of readers and thousands of comments from around the world, some outraged, others deeply moved. Soon after, History.com released an in-depth analysis of the widespread issue of forgotten veterans. They cited data showing thousands of former service members left the military without receiving the support they needed, with many falling into poverty or being put to society's margin. The article placed Alicia's case within this broader context, portraying her as the face of a system that is neglectful and cold. They described her years as a janitor not as a voluntary choice, but as the result of a chain of gender and racial bias. The analysis left readers unable to look away, forcing them to confront the painful truth: countless silent heroes have been erased from the justice they deserve. Other news outlets followed suit. From the New York Times to the Washington Post, journalists covered the story from multiple angles. Some interviewed Alicia's former squadmates, who confirmed she had led dangerous missions and saved many lives. Others explored her current life, describing the cramped room she lived in and the worn military pin she kept in a drawer as the only relic of her past. These images stirred a sense of sorrow in readers, but also sparked a belief that this story had to be told to end the cycle of indifference. The pressure from the media made it impossible for those in power to ignore. Political commentary shows invited experts and veterans to discuss the cracks in the military system. Some analysts stressed that Alicia's case was not just a personal tragedy, but a warning bell for deeper systemic injustice. They asked how many others might be living as Alicia had, trapped between a glorious past and a harsh present. These questions echoed widely, becoming topics of conversation everywhere from parliamentary hearings to local coffee shops. In that context, Alicia's image was no longer confined to a single video. She appeared on magazine covers, in long television features, and was mentioned in international opinion pieces. Every time her name was brought up, two contrasting images followed: a janitor with an old broom and a fighter pilot seated firmly in the cockpit. Placed side by side, those images carried multiplied force, compelling the public to reflect on the fragile line between honor and humiliation, between light and shadow. From then on, Alicia's story was no longer an isolated incident, but a global symbol of the desire for justice and rightful recognition of those who had once served. As articles kept surfacing, one question echoed loudly everywhere: why 8 years of silence? The question wasn't just for Alicia Monroe, but aimed at the entire system that allowed a woman who once sat in a fighter jet cockpit to live in the shadows. TV discussions, social media threads, and public forums all circled back to this core issue. The public would not accept vague explanations explanation. They wanted to know who had pushed a former pilot to the margin, who had left her to sweep floors, instead of honoring her as a hero. Political panels began mentioning Alicia's name as a case of injustice, with many scholars arguing that 8 years of silence couldn't be reduced to personal choice. It reflected a harsh environment. Prejudice and abuse of power shackled those who had sacrificed. Human rights organizations joined in, releasing statements demanding accountability from the military. As more voices spoke up, pressure intensified. Television channels ran split-screen footage. On one side, Alicia soaring through the sky, on the other, quietly sweeping a floor. Contrast outraged viewers, prompting them to ask why society had ignored such an obvious truth for so long. As the public demanded answers, military police found themselves in unprecedented difficulty. Emergency meetings were held, but all plans for silence quickly collapsed under the weight of public outrage. Spokespeople gave vague, evasive responses that only fueled more anger. News outlets captured images of officers leaving briefing rooms in silence, none daring to look into the cameras. That act of avoidance became further proof of weakness, drawing even more ridicule. Social media exploded with satirical images, showing the same officers who once mocked Alicia now stumbling away, faces pale, surrounded by reporters. Sarcastic captions spread like wildfire. A hero buried for 8 years, cowards looking down for 8 seconds. Public sentiment turned the military police's confusion into a collective joke, one far more devastating than any editorial. Inside the barrack, a heavy atmosphere hung over everything. Those who had taken part in humiliating Alicia lived in daily anxiety, aware that their faces and names might already have been identified by the online community. The fear of being exposed kept them awake at night, while their superiors struggled to find any way to cover it up. Each time a new article revealed more details, each time a witness spoke out, they were pushed deeper into the position of the accused. No one could control the narrative anymore, because the public had become the judge, and the media was the loudspeaker amplifying every mistake. The growing pressure made it clear to many that silence could not last. Without a proper explanation, public outrage would become a storm, one strong enough to tear apart a system built on silence. And in the middle of that turmoil, the image of Alicia Monroe stood out more clearly than ever, not just as a witness to injustice, but as the symbol forcing an entire institution to lower its head. That day, the Capitol building was packed, hallways buzzing with footsteps and the constant flash of cameras. Everyone was waiting for the appearance of the woman who had shaken the entire nation. When the doors opened, Alicia Monroe walked in, calm and composed, her gaze steady. The hearing room fell silent instantly, every eye fixed on her. Microphones were already on, notebooks lay open on the committee's table, and the audience seats were filled, many of them veterans wearing insignia, there to witness this moment. Alicia sat down, back straight, hands resting in front of her. In that moment, she was no longer a janitor belittled on base, but a witness for justice, preparing to speak. The chairperson called the session to order, introduced the purpose of the hearing, and then invited Alicia to speak. The room remained still, broadcast cameras trained on her. Alicia glanced around, her eyes pausing on the solemn faces before her. Her voice came low and hoarse, clear. "I was pushed out of the mission because of my skin color and gender." Not a sound interrupted. Her words landed like a hammer, striking the floor. Some members froze, eyes wide, while faint whispers stirred in the back rows. Those who had once doubted now sat silent, for her words carried not just bitterness, but the weight of a buried truth. Alicia continued, recounting the years she was forced out of the cockpit, the times her proposals were dismissed solely because she was a black woman. She spoke of missions she had flown, leading squadrons through enemy fire, saving comrades' lives, only to return home to suspicion instead of recognition. The room followed her every word, some taking notes, others maintaining intense eye contact. Her testimony was free of dramatic, just raw truth, and that simplicity made the room grow heavier with each sentence. An older congressman finally spoke, his voice trembling. "You're saying your entire career was buried because of prejudice?" Alicia nodded, eyes firm. "Yes, and for 8 years I was forced to live under an identity that wasn't mine, just to survive." Quiet sighs swept the room, some rubbed their foreheads as if struggling to process the truth. Cameras shift, capturing the faces of several younger lawmakers, eyes lit with intensity as they scribbled notes, preparing for the questioning ahead. The hearing was not just a platform for Alicia's voice, but also for the veterans seated behind her to testify. One stood up and said Alicia had pulled him from a bullet-riddled plane, leading the entire unit out of an ambush. His account crashed over the room like a wave, making it even harder for the committee to deflect. The truth was no longer on paper or buried in rumor, but embodied in living people, those who owed their lives to Alicia's courage. The air in the room grew heavier with each passing moment, the silence broken only by the tapping of pens and the soft rustle of paper. Every time Alicia paused, the room seemed to hold its breath, absorbing the weight of her words. The outrage of the public outside had now turned into a quiet reckoning among those seated before her. They knew, from that moment on, no excuse would be enough to hide injustice. That hearing marked a turning point, not only for Alicia, but for the entire system. It brought the truth into the open, forcing those who once looked away to confront their responsibility. And on the live broadcast, millions watched, listened to every word, and reached the same undeniable conclusion. A woman who had been dismissed for 8 years finally spoken, and her voice was powerful enough to shake the foundations of authority. When Alicia Monroe finished speaking, the room fell silent, stern faces lowered, and a few pens stopped mid-sentence. An elderly congressman, silver-haired and visibly shaken, spoke with a trembling voice. "We have betrayed our own hero." The words cut deep, striking the room like a blade. The truth had already been laid bare, but coming from someone in power, it became a confession on behalf of an entire institution. No one responded because no one dared to deny it. The veterans behind Alicia nodded, eyes wet, as if finally seen after years of silence. That moment was captured by cameras and quickly edited into a short clip that spread across social media. The image of the congressman gripping the table, his weathered face etched with regret, paired with his haunting words, became the headline everywhere. The hearing clip replayed again and again, capturing not only Alicia's testimony, but the raw reactions of those who listened. On Twitter, the video amassed millions of shares within hours, and the phrase, "We betrayed a hero," echoed like an indictment against society itself. On TikTok, young people layered his voice over solemn music, pairing shots of Alicia in the cockpit with her entering the hearing room. The contrast between the two images sent chills through viewers. Many wrote that they had never witnessed a moment so painful and powerful. Major news outlets placed the quote front and center, declaring it a reckoning that demanded the nation reflect on how it treated those who had sacrificed in silence. The clip's impact went beyond emotion. It sparked a wide-reaching wave of discussion. People debated the accountability of commanders, the role of bias in grounding an exceptional pilot, and the injustice of turning her into a nameless janitor. Angry comments poured in, insisting, "Betraying a hero is betraying the values this country claims to uphold." The statement was echoed in classrooms, repeated at family dinner tables, and held up as a mirror to a shame that could no longer be hidden. Alicia remained seated quietly in her small room when she learned that the hearing clip had gone viral. She was not seeking the spotlight, but the widespread circulation felt like a message from millions that they stood with her. After years of being forgotten, truth had not only been spoken, but had been lifted, protected, and etched into the collective memory. To her, it was not a personal victory, but a revival of faith and justice that even a lone voice can echo powerfully when it speaks the truth. The entire nation talked, the whole world watched, and Alicia's story no longer belonged to a single base or a congressional hearing. It had gone beyond that, becoming a global symbol of resilience and the steep cost of silence. The clip kept spreading, endlessly re-edited, subtitled, and translated into multiple languages. Each time it played, the words cut deeper into the conscience of society. "We betrayed our own hero." Following the hearing, the first steps of the investigation were launched. An emergency order was issued, requiring all military police officers directly involved in the humiliation and mistreatment of Alicia Monroe to appear before the disciplinary council. They were summoned with irrefutable evidence, the video capturing their mockery, the sarcastic remarks shouted in the canteen, and the footage of them deliberately dumping a bucket of water to humiliate. What once seemed like petty acts to satisfy fragile egos had now become official investigative material, turning them from hecklers into the accused. Inside the base, the news spread quickly, a heavy tension settled in, and though many watched quietly, few dared to speak. It was clear this had gone far beyond internal affairs. International media stepped in immediately, naming individuals without hesitation and publishing clear photographs. Faces that once exuded arrogance now appeared on front pages under bold headlines. "Traitors to honor." Articles laid out every detail, every insult thrown at Alicia, backed by video evidence. The truth was no longer buried in the shadows, it was exposed under the full light of justice, leaving them nowhere to hide. Netizens continued to share the reports, and angry comments flooded in, demanding real consequence. One user wrote, "If these people represent military police, then what's left of their honor?" Another added, "No one has the right to trample a hero." Press briefings, reporters bombarded military officials with questions about accountability. Several high-ranking officers were forced to speak on camera, faces tense, voices strained. Knowing every word would be scrutinized, they tried to deflect with vague responses, but the more they dodged, the more outrage grew. On television, the contrast was striking. On one side, Alicia calmly facing the world. On the other, the officers and their superiors visibly flustered, sweating as they scrambled to defend themselves. Public pressure escalated into an unprecedented wave. Numerous civil organizations submitted petitions demanding that the investigation be expanded, not just to those directly involved, but also to those who enabled or ignored the abuse. People were no longer satisfied with symbolic punishments, they demanded complete transparency. Small protests began forming outside the base gates, citizens holding banners that read, "Justice for Alicia," their chants echoing through the air. International media captured captured the scene, placing it on front pages with headlines declaring the case a global symbol in the fight against military injustice. In every editorial, writers emphasized that this was not just about one woman, but a wake-up call for the entire system. They asked, how many others have been buried like Alicia, without ever getting a chance to speak? The question echoed loudly, pushing the investigation far beyond a limited scope. And those officers now summoned weren't just facing a disciplinary board, they were facing the judgment of a watching world. At the first testimony session, the summoned officers showed clear signs of tension. Their faces were pale, their voices hesitant, and they scrambled to find ways to minimize their guilt. One of them spoke up, his voice trembling. We were just joking. We didn't mean to seriously offend anyone. The others quickly nodded in agreement, repeating the same refrain in hopes of softening their responsibility. They insisted it was just an internal joke, that no one expected things to go this. But before the disciplinary council, those excuses rang hollow, because the evidence was undeniable. Every insult, every act of humiliation, had been recorded and broadcast across the world. News of their defense quickly leaked, and became the center of public outrage. Major news outlets ran bold headlines. Officers say, just a joke, after humiliating female pilot. Millions of readers erupted in anger, furious comments flooding every article. Discrimination is a joke now? One person wrote. Another snapped. If this is a joke, then what does real offense look like? The wave of fury surged higher, turning their excuses into flames that only burned them further. Clips from the hearing were widely shared, showing their nervous faces as proof of their dishonesty. On social media, new hashtags exploded. Number note joke. Number stop calling it a joke. Accompanied by images comparing scenes of Alicia being humiliated with her flying high in the sky. Users emphasized again and again that humiliation, discrimination, and abuse cannot be excused. 2 words. Just joking. They argued that this very mindset had enabled violence and prejudice within the military for decades. Each angry post struck like a hammer, cracking what was left of the military police's public image and pushing them deeper into disgrace. Television programs brought on experts and activists to dissect the hearing. They firmly rejected the officer's explanation. One sociologist stated, "When power is used to turn someone into a joke, it's not humor, it's abuse." That quote was repeated everywhere, becoming the strongest rebuttal to the desperate attempt to shift blame. Protests in the streets echoed the same message, crowds chanting in unison, "Discrimination is not a joke," until the phrase rang through every avenue and alley. Inside the base, the atmosphere turned darker. The officers knew every escape route had been shut, and every word they said only deepened public outrage. Fellow soldiers, once silent, now distanced themselves, fearing the backlash would spill over onto them. The military police, once confident in their authority, were now floundering, helpless, unable to find a single argument strong enough to change the tide. They realized the truth was out of their hands, and the phrase, "just a joke," would remain a permanent stain they could never wash away. Alicia watched everything from a distance, saying nothing, her eyes calm. She knew society had risen to defend the truth on her behalf. The story no longer belonged to her alone, it had become proof of change. Those who once mocked her now had to face the outcry of millions, and the excuse, "just joking," had become the weakest defense in history, crushed under the weight of justice and public judgment. Before the committee and under the watchful eyes of millions tuning in via television, Alicia Monroe revealed for the first time that she had kept hidden for 8 years. Her voice was slow but resolute, each word deep into memories laced pain. She spoke of a brutal mission in the past, surrounded by smoke and fire, where comrades fell beside her, and she had to lead the remaining squad through a hail of bullets to survive. The battle ended, but her mind never left. Each night, explosions echoed in her head. The faces of those who vanished returned with piercing clarity, pushing her toward exhaustion. She said, "I was never afraid to face the enemy, but I couldn't survive the long nights when the memories returned." It was the first time she admitted she had suffered from PTSD after the war, a wound no one could see, but one that tore at her soul every day. Alicia shared that after that mission, no one checked on her or offered support. Her decorated service record was filed away, while her emotional trauma was ignored. There were no psychologists, no recovery programs, only silence. She had submitted multiple requests for help, but all she received were dismissive looks and cold rejection. A black female pilot wasn't seen the same way as her peers, and because of that, her wounds cut even deeper. "I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because I no longer believed anyone would listen," she said, her eyes shimmering, though no tears fell. When she was pushed out of the squadron, Alicia was forced to find a way to survive. She recounted how, in those early months, she applied for jobs everywhere, but her military-heavy resume and the suspicious stares at her skin color and gender shut every door. In the end, janitorial work was the only way to afford food and rent. "I cleaned floors not because I wanted to, but because it was the only way to stay alive," she admitted, her voice cracking but firm. Her words left the entire room in silence. Many lowered their heads, eyes reddened. Lawmakers, used to dry reports, were now faced with the story of a real person, a hero forced to hide her identity just to survive. The image of Alicia with a mop in hand for 8 long long years, no longer felt like surrender. It stood as the clearest evidence of a system's indifference. The press captured the moment in full, spreading it everywhere. New headlines emerged: "Silence for survival" and "A hero abandoned." The online community erupted again, not just with outrage over discrimination, but with fury at the failure of those in power. People wrote, "No veteran should ever have to live like this," and "If this country lets a fighter pilot become a janitor, then we've lost the soul of our nation." Alicia sat in silence after finishing her story, shoulders still squared, eyes still proud. The truth of 8 years was no longer a burden she carried alone, but a shared reality the entire society now had to face. From that moment on, her story was no longer a personal secret, but a mirror reflecting neglect, a reminder that justice must never abandon those who gave their lives to the sky and to the nation. As Alicia Monroe recounted her years in the shadows, the room remained heavy with silence. No lawmaker interrupted, no whisper dared to rise. Everyone understood that her words were not just personal memories, but an indictment of years-long indifference. Alicia paused briefly, took a deep breath, and looked forward, as if piercing through the invisible walls of prejudice. Her voice was low but steady, but the pride of a pilot was never lost. The words weren't loud, but they struck with the force of an engine starting powerful and resolute. People saw the truth in her eyes that no matter how many floors she had to clean, or how often she was belittled, the spirit of a combat pilot could not be erased. That pride lived in the sinews of hands once wrapped around a flight stick, in the nights she battled trauma without letting it extinguish her will. It lived in 8 years of silence, not silence of surrender, but silence that guarded a flame from being snuffed out by the storm. And now, that flame had risen again, not only through a flawless roll in the sky, but by her rightful presence before Congress, where justice had no choice but to listen. As the hearing aired live, millions of viewers across the country tuned in. They saw Alicia's calm face, heard her hoarse but unwavering voice, and felt a truth stronger than any written report. Television channels replayed her statement, treating it as a new emblem in the fight against injustice. On social media, the phrase, "pride of a pilot was never lost," appeared everywhere, quoted in thousands of posts, printed on signs, shared as status updates, pledged that the truth would never be buried again. Inside the hearing room, the veterans seated behind her couldn't hide their emotion. One placed a hand over his chest, nodding slowly, his eyes glistening as if to say that justice had finally found a voice. A young lawmaker rose, directly at Alicia, and said, "Today, it has been brought to light for all to see." That declaration echoed through the chamber, marking a turning point. From this moment on, no one could look away, no one could justify humiliation with the word joke, and no one could claim they hadn't known the truth. The event quickly became a global headline. Major news outlets from Europe to Asia picked it up, emphasizing that this was proof of the power of pride and resilience. Many commentators noted that Alicia's case wasn't just a personal story, but a reminder that any society that forgets those who sacrificed will eventually pay the price. And it was that unshakable pride that forced the entire system to reflect on itself. In schools, teachers used Alicia's story as an example in lessons about justice and dignity. They told students about a woman who had once been dismissed, forced to set aside her dreams, but ultimately proved the truth of who she was. Many children drew fighter jets with the caption, "Number pilot janitor" underneath, seeing it as a symbol of the belief that a person's worth cannot be erased by their job or appearance. From that story, a new generation was inspired to believe that pride lies not only in victory, but in how we hold on to ourselves, pushed into the dark. Alicia sat quietly, as the large screen in the chamber replayed footage of her soaring through the sky. She knew this wasn't a moment to bask in personal triumph, but a chance to open a new path. 8 years of endurance, 8 years of silence, had now come to an end. She understood that from this day on, eyes would turn to her not to mock, but to remember that truth always finds a way to rise. And once it stands in the open, no wall can hide it, force can break it. The hearing came to a close, but its echoes lingered. In the blue sky that day, Alicia's role still burned in the memory of those who witnessed it, cannot fade. The pride she preserved as a pilot had survived 8 buried years, now becoming a symbol not just for herself, but for all who had been forgotten in the shadow of prejudice. And as the sun set, people knew with certainty that this story would never be buried again. Right after the hearing, before the camera lights had fully dimmed, a group of people quietly approached Alicia Monroe. They wore simple jackets, their hair streaked with gray, but their eyes burned bright like old flames that had never gone out. They were the former pilots who had once shared the sky with her. No introductions were needed. They walked quickly toward her, wrapping Alicia in a tight embrace. One so firm, the entire room fell silent, as if the long years of silence had dissolved in that moment. Alicia gently closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she placed them on each of their shoulders, feeling she was no longer alone. Silence filled the chamber. No one dared interrupt the reunion. One of the former pilots raised his head, his voice deep but clear, recounting the memory of that fateful day. He spoke of the life or death mission, when the entire squadron was pinned down by heavy fire, the escape route completely blocked. In what seemed like a hopeless situation, Alicia's voice came calmly through the radio, laying out a daring flight path that led the team through the fire. "If it weren't for her, we wouldn't be here today," he said, locking eyes with the lawmakers, as if etching the truth into their minds. Another stepped forward, describing in detail how Alicia had risked her life to shield a wounded comrade, holding the formation together. They spoke of how she flew as if her plane moved to the beat of her heart, every roll and dive a line between life and death. Their voices trembled, the memories still vivid, and finally saying them aloud brought a sense of release. These weren't just words of praise anymore, but undeniable proof that Alicia wasn't just a pilot, she was the one who saved them, true leader in their most desperate moment. The entire chamber remained silent as each word was spoken. No more murmurs, no more hurried scribbling of notes. Only respect was shown in the eyes of everyone present. The veterans stood in a circle around Alicia, each laying a hand on her shoulder, affirming that she belonged with them, belonged to the shared legacy of the squadron, not to the lowly position society had forced upon her. The image was captured by journalists, spreading instantly, and adding another wave of emotion to the storm outside. Alicia looked at each familiar face, a wave of emotion rising in her chest. She remembered those days in the cockpit bathed in red light, their voices coming through the radio anxious, shaky, but always steady when hearing her commands. Now they stood before her, recalling aloud what no one had dared say for 8 years. "I thought you'd forgotten," Alicia whispered. A teammate smiled tears. "We never forgot, we just never had the chance to say it." In that moment, the old wounds in Alicia's heart seemed to ease. The loneliness that had weighed on her for years was replaced by the arms of those who had faced by her side. No further evidence was needed, their presence alone was enough to end any doubt. The world could debate all it wanted, but those who had flown through fire with her were the strongest witness, and now, they had come to confirm it, to restore Alicia the place she had always deserved. The hearing closed in an unforgettable echo, as the woman once forced into silence stood surrounded by the arms of her former comrades, hearing again the story she should never have had to tell alone. That day, the public didn't just witness a forgotten hero, they saw a symbol of loyalty, of memory that could not be erased. 8 years buried in silence had finally received an answer, through the voices of those who had survived because of her courage. The arms wrapped tightly around Alicia Monroe that day quickly became the most prominent image on the front pages of news. Reporters' lenses captured the moment the former pilots, hair streaked gray but eyes still burning with loyal fire, embraced her as living proof of a truth that could not be denied. The press called it a historic moment when a woman once forgotten was publicly acknowledged and protected by those who had flown beside her. The articles didn't just tell the story in words, they let the image speak for itself, a reunion powerful enough to move millions to tears. The photographs spread quickly, picked up by international outlets who placed them on their covers with a simple caption, "The hero returns." On social media, users shared the image relentlessly, adding heart captions. One wrote, "Some truths can't stay buried, it always finds its way." Another said, "This is the most beautiful image I've ever seen, proves brotherhood and justice never disappear." Millions of shares followed, turning the moment into a symbol of justice finally restored. Amid the media whirlwind, people most was Alicia's reaction. After years spent under the cold eyes and contempt of those in power, for the first time, she allowed herself a real smile. It was a simple, gentle smile, but in her eyes was the vast sky she had waited 8 years to see again. It wasn't a smile of victory, it was the smile of release, of someone finally seen for who she truly was. Photographers captured it, and that smile quickly became just as iconic as the embrace. Opinion pieces flooded in, analyzing how Alicia's smile wasn't just a personal moment, it was proof of justice's power. It declared that no matter how deeply buried, a person's true worth never disappears, as long as there comes a day when the light shines on it again. Sociologists said that moment struck a chord because it made people believe that dignity and perseverance, however long they may wait, can still be reclaimed. In the hearing room, as Alicia smiled, many couldn't hold back their emotion. Lawmakers who had once worn cold expressions now nodded slightly, some even placing their hands over their hearts as if offering a silent apology. The veterans seated behind her rose in unison, applauding for a long time, turning that moment into a clear declaration that she was no longer alone. The extended applause echoed beyond the room, through the television cameras, into homes everywhere, allowing everyone to feel the impact of a truly sacred moment. For Alicia, that day's smile marked a turning point, closing the chapter of 8 humiliating years of silence. It opened a new one, where she no longer needed to prove anything. Everything had already been validated by her comrades, by the media, and by the public's respect. From that moment on, she knew she had found herself again, no longer the quiet figure with a mop, combat pilot who once carried the pride of the skies on her shoulders. And most importantly, she knew that this time, that recognition could never be taken away. 1 week after the hearing, the entire country turned its attention to a press conference held at the Department of Defense headquarters. On a solemn wooden podium beneath the national emblem, the Secretary of Defense stepped forward, his face heavy with gravity. He paused for a few seconds in front of hundreds of cameras, bowed his head slightly, then began, his voice low but clear. On behalf of the military, I offer a public apology to Alicia Monroe. We allowed someone who gave her all for the skies, who led her comrades through danger, to live in neglect and disgrace. That was an inexcusable failure. The words echoed through the hall, and many held their breath. This was not a perfunctory apology, but the admission of a system that had remained silent for far too long. Millions watched live through television and social media. In cafes and living rooms, people stopped what they were doing and listened to every word. When the secretary admitted that the military had failed to protect those who had once protected the nation, a wave of reactions surged. On Twitter, the phrase, "historic apology," quickly trended. With the speech quoted in countless emotional posts, some cried at the long overdue recognition, others remained angry, believing the apology came too late. But regardless of the response, all understood this was an irreversible moment, a door now open for justice to take another step forward. In the room, Alicia sat in the front row, her gaze calm yet deep. When she heard her name spoken by the highest-ranking military official, her lips trembled slightly, her hands clenched tightly on her lap. She didn't cry, but those nearby could see the emotion rising in her dark eyes. For the first time in 8 years, an institution that once turned its back on her had bowed its head and admitted fault. The former pilots behind her stood up, breaking into thunderous applause that overpowered the clicks of the cameras. The secretary continued, pledging a full investigation and strict disciplinary action against those who had abused their power to humiliate Alicia. He also promised a reform of the veteran support system, ensuring that no one would be left behind like this again. These promises were recorded and broadcast globally. A public commitment, truth had prevailed, and the wounds would begin to heal. People listened, not everyone believed fully, but all understood that public pressure had forced the system to change. After the press conference, a photo of Alicia shaking the secretary's hand appeared on the front pages of countless news. It wasn't a handshake of full forgiveness, but a confirmation that a long journey toward justice had reached a turning point. She hadn't asked for an apology, but it had come not just for her, but for all those left behind in silence. Millions who watched live witnessed a rare event, the military publicly admitting fault to an individual, turning Alicia's story into a landmark that history would remember for a very long time. In the moment when every eye in the room was still fixed on the podium, Alicia Monroe sat quietly, face unmoved. As the Secretary of Defense bowed one final time, and the room erupted in scattered applause that slowly built into a deep, resonant wave, she gave a slight nod. It was a small gesture, but enough for everyone to understand that she had heard, had accepted, and had also brought an end to 8 years of silence. In her eyes, there was a blend of pride and sorrow, a sense of honor that the truth had finally been acknowledged, and a quiet grief for the price she had paid to get there. Pride belonged to the skies, where she had survived and triumphed, and that sorrow belonged to the ground, where she had been forgotten and demeaned for years. Photographers captured every second, their lenses locking onto that gaze, and the image of Alicia nodding became the latest symbol on international pages. The headlines did not just recount the apology, focused on the weight of that silent moment, when a woman who had endured the storm stood tall before the very system that had failed her. Journalists described her eyes as mirrors, reflecting both a bright, unshakable dignity, quiet pain that no one could erase. People read those articles and shared them by the thousands, because in Alicia's gaze, they saw not just one woman's story, but the story of an entire generation of forgotten veterans. On social media, the commentary was relentless. People admired Alicia for her composure and strength, but were equally bitter over the years she had been forced to endure. "What can a late apology do for 8 years already lost?" someone wrote. Another added, "She has every right to be proud, but the sadness in her eyes shows that some wounds never heal." That line struck millions of hearts, turning the public's attention not just toward relief that the truth had been recognized, but also toward a shared grief for the irreparable losses. As Alicia left the hearing room, reporters crowded in with a flood of questions, but the most powerful question didn't come from a journalist, it came from her. In front of the cameras, she paused, took a slow breath, and said, "How many other heroes have been forgotten?" The question was brief, but it silenced the world. It was no longer just about one woman forced into janitorial work, a question that opened a wider door, making people think about the names never spoken again, the faces that disappeared into the dark without notice. The question quickly became the center of intense national debate. Television networks invited military experts, historians, and veterans to discuss it. Some recited dry statistics about about unemployed, homeless, or depressed veterans after the war. Others shared personal stories of comrades who risked everything in combat only to return and be shunned by the society they fought for. Those numbers and stories were the answer to Alicia's question, and they were so painful that no one could turn away. In many cities, people took to the streets carrying banners with that, treating it as a slogan meant to awaken collective conscience. How many other heroes have been forgotten? Became the phrase spray-painted on walls, printed on and hung across banners. Discussions in schools, families, and workplaces all brought it up, as if everyone had been forced to confront a void that had been ignored for too long. The government came under increasing pressure, compelled to begin reviewing and improving veteran policies, because if not, they would continue to face criticism for letting that come to light without taking action. For Alicia, the question wasn't meant to demand a definite answer, but to serve as a reminder that her story was just one among countless others. As she walked through the golden light of that evening, many stood by the roadside and raised their hands in salute, eyes glistening not just with admiration but with understanding. She had turned her personal pain into a torch, lighting the way for an entire community, and reminded everyone that justice does not end with an apology, but must begin with the search for those left behind. The final image of that day, printed in bold across major newspapers, was Alicia's silhouette leaving the Capitol building, her gaze filled with pride and sorrow. Beneath the caption, there was only one question: how many other heroes have been forgotten? It echoed not only across America but throughout the world, leaving a resonance no one could easily erase. The pressure from public opinion and overwhelming evidence left the military justice system with no choice but to open a special court session. Trial date was set, and the military courtroom was packed with reporters, veterans, and civilians eager to witness justice in action. As the judge entered, the sound of the gavel echoed against the dry wooden floor, signaling a new chapter in the entire case. On the defendant's bench, the police officers who once arrogantly humiliated Alicia Monroe now sat silent, heads bowed, with no trace of the swagger they once wore. Cameras zoomed in on each of them, capturing the fear and shame etched on their faces, turning them into symbols of disgrace before public judgment. During the reading of the charges, the prosecutor clearly articulated each count: abuse of power, racial discrimination, and conduct unbecoming of a service member. Every word struck like a hammer, and the courtroom fell into deep silence, broken only by the scratching of pens and heavy breathing. The viral videos showing them throwing water buckets and mocking Alicia were played again in court. The footage made many shudder, not just for the disrespect, but for how clearly it revealed the contempt bred within authority. The prosecutor emphasized they forgot that the uniform is meant to protect honor, not trample on others. The defense attorneys tried to salvage their case, arguing it had all been a joke, that no one intended long-term harm, but the prosecution quickly rebutted, stating that mockery could never justify systemic abuse. Witness testimony from a young soldier who had seen it all dismantled the defense further. He described the humiliation Alicia endured, even admitting to the fear in his own eyes that stopped him from speaking up, and ended with a sentence that left the room in stunned silence. "I stayed quiet, and that's what I regret most." When the judge delivered the verdict, the air thickened. He looked directly at the defendants and said, with a heavy yet firm voice, "These actions not only break military discipline, they betray the core values we are sworn to uphold." He then handed down sentences ranging from demotion and discharge to prison time for the ringleader. Each ruling brought murmurs, and the sound of fists tapping on tables from the veterans in the room. They nodded, not out of joy, but because they finally saw justice carried out with clarity. The media reported instantly, with bold headlines reading, "Military police convicted of abuse and discrimination." The articles highlighted the bitter contrast, from mocking a woman they deemed beneath to now sitting under the weight of severe sentences. On social media, the images spread quickly, serving as a warning bell. Comments poured in, many saying, "Justice came late, but at least it came." Another added, "You can't call it a joke when the damage lasted 8 years." Alicia did not attend the trial in person, but her image was placed on the witness stand as a symbolic present. Her previous testimonies, along with the truth already laid bare in the skies, had become an undeniable indictment, and when the judge brought down the gavel, the public understood that the days of abusers escaping justice were over. From that moment on, the story no longer ended with personal pain. It became a reminder to all of society that justice may be slow, but it will find those who betray trust. When the verdict was announced, the air in the courtroom turned suffocating. The officers who had once loudly mocked Alicia Monroe now sat hunched, their shoulders trembling. One suddenly stood, voice cracking in fear, "Please give us a chance. We were wrong." The plea rang out, prompting others to scramble to their feet, hastily echoing the same hope for mercy. Their faces were drenched in sweat, hands clasped, eyes desperately fixed on the witness stand where Alicia sat quietly. Their begging filled the room, but the sound stirred no sympathy. It only highlighted the brutal contrast between the past they had created and the present they now faced. Some in the courtroom stirred slightly, but all waited for Alicia's response. She stood with calm composure, no outburst of anger, but that very stillness made her opponents shudder even more. She looked directly at the defendant, not with hatred, but with a gaze cold and sharp as a blade. Her voice rang out clearly, each word echoing through the room. Forgiveness doesn't erase justice. No one misunderstood what that meant. It was a firm declaration that personal mercy cannot substitute for legal and societal accountability. The courtroom fell dead silent, broken only by the frantic scribbling of journalists. Alicia's words immediately became the highlight, spreading through live news coverage. Reporters rushed to write a response like a second sentence. On social media, users quickly shared the quote, thousands of comments pouring in, many expressing admiration for how she spoke for those who had suffered in silence. Forgiveness doesn't erase justice became a new rallying cry, printed boldly on images and raised on banners in small protest marches that followed shortly after. The officers heard Alicia's response and lowered their heads, some sobbing quietly, but none dared to object. They knew every escape route had been closed off, and every plea only made them look more pitiful. A few veterans sitting behind nodded slowly, their eyes full of firm agreement, because they understood that justice cannot be traded for belated apology. To them, justice is the only thing that protects a soldier's dignity, and Alicia's words had struck directly at the heart of that sacred. When the trial ended, the press simultaneously published images of Alicia standing tall, eyes unwavering, with the caption below, "Forgiveness doesn't erase justice." It was more than a quote, it was the declaration of a woman who had endured years of being crushed, only to rise and become a symbol of resilience. To the public, that response marked the end of all attempts at justification, and it served as a reminder, truth and justice must walk together, not be buried under belated regret. That day, Alicia stepped out of the courthouse in solemn silence. No one dared to cheer, no one clapped loudly, there were only nods, only respectful gazes, because everyone understood that her words were not spoken for vengeance, but to remind the world of an unshakable principle. Mercy can heal, but only when justice is upheld does truth truly hold its meaning. After long days of investigation and trial, a formal ceremony was held in the Grand Hall of the Department of Defense. The lights blazed, national flags covered the walls, and rows were packed with guests and veterans. On the high stage, the host solemnly read Alicia Monroe's name, the voice firm and resonant. Combat pilot, forgotten for 8 years, now reinstated with honor. Applause erupted, loud and unending. Alicia stepped onto the stage, her demeanor composed, her gaze calm, but the light in her eyes burned brighter than ever. When the minister pinned the medal to her chest, the entire hall stood up. That moment wasn't just to honor an individual, but to acknowledge that history had made a mistake, and now, it was trying to make it right. The medal glinting under the lights wasn't a consolation prize, but a symbol of reaffirmation, restoring the place that had always belonged to her. Alicia gently placed her hand on the medal, took a deep breath, and then bowed. No need for grand speeches. That simple gesture was enough to silence the room in emotion. Many veterans wiped their eyes, they understood that feeling more than anyone, because they had witnessed sacrifices that weren't always recognized. After the ceremony, military academies across the country sent invitations asking Alicia to speak. They wanted future officers to hear directly from someone who had lived through both glory and hardship, to understand that honor doesn't lie in rank or power, but in loyalty to the skies and to the truth. Alicia accepted, because she believed if her story could stop even one person from falling into the same darkness she once faced, that would be her way of giving back to life. On her first day entering the main hall of the Air Force Academy, hundreds of cadets in crisp uniforms rose in unison, their eyes filled with respect. Alicia didn't say much. She recounted her journey, from life or death missions to the years she survived by holding a janitor's broom. She emphasized, true pride never disappears, it just waits for the day it's seen. The cadets sat in silence. Many clenched their fists, and some eyes glistened with emotion. Alicia's speeches quickly became the most anticipated events at other academies. People didn't just learn flight strategy or combat skills, they learned the strength of resilience. Her stories planted in the hearts of the younger generation a belief justice, though slow, would arrive, and that a person buried in silence can still rise with full dignity. The press called Alicia a guiding light for young pilots, while students at the academies saw her as a source of inspiration, writing her words into their notebook, turning them into personal creed. Returning to glory, Alicia did not seek the spotlight for herself. To her, each story told was a chance to ignite hope in the next generation, so that no one would ever be cast aside again because of prejudice. And in the eyes of the young people seated before her, she saw that the pain of those 8 years had become strength, so that today could rise again, and pride could soar once more. At a grand military academy graduation ceremony, Alicia Monroe appeared as the guest speaker. Thousands of cadets sat upright in the stands, uniforms immaculate, eyes shining with the pride of those who had just completed a grueling training program. The campus buzzed with excitement, but when Alicia stepped onto the podium, every murmur faded. She stood tall, one hand resting gently on the wooden lectern, her face calm, her gaze sweeping across the rows. No lengthy introduction was needed. Her name was now known to all as a symbol of resilience. She began by speaking of her journey, of brutal flight, of losses etched deep into memory, and of the years she was pushed to the margins by prejudice. Her voice was warm but firm, each word carved into the air, drawing the full attention of every cadet. Alicia paused briefly, glancing at the front row where young faces looked up, full of hope. Then she said, "Strength lies in the heart, not in prejudice." A simple sentence, but its resonance was so powerful that the entire field seemed to tremble with silent agreement. In that moment, the young soldiers felt they had taken a new oath, not only to their country, but to themselves. They understood that discipline and skill were the foundation, but the heart was what would guide them through every decision. Alicia had turned her story into living proof that a person may be buried under judgment, but nothing can extinguish the strength born from inner belief. Her words echoed in each listener's chest, planting the truth that honor cannot be measured by rank or skin color, but only by action and loyalty to principle. Right after those words, the entire stadium erupted. Applause thundered like a storm, relentless and overwhelming. Thousands of hands clapped in unison, the sound bouncing off the walls and rippling across the wide-open field. Many cadets jumped to their feet, cheering as if they had witnessed a victory not on the battlefield, but in spirit. They weren't just applauding Alicia, but the new conviction that had just taken root within themselves. More than a few wiped away tears, as the moment pressed upon them the true weight of a soldier's duty. The press present at the ceremony immediately captured the moment. Images of Alicia standing at the podium, with a sea of people rising to their feet in applause, quickly filled news headlines. Front pages ran titles like, "Thunderous applause for the unbroken pilot." On social media, clips of the moment were shared millions of. Many commented that they had never seen a graduation ceremony so full of pride and feeling. Alicia's quote appeared in bold across countless, becoming a new motto for a generation. For Alicia, that moment was not about personal glory, but the revival of. Looking at the radiant young faces before her, she understood that the wounds of the past had become lessons to pass on to a new generation. The smile that briefly appeared on her lips was no longer the strained smile of the past, but a smile of affirmation. She knew that from now on, her story would live on in the hearts of those young soldiers, like a flame reminding them of the true nature of strength. And the thunderous applause that day was not just for one woman, but for justice, for the pride handed down from one generation to the next. When the ceremonies honoring Alicia Monroe subsided, the echo of her story spread beyond the military and academies into civilian life. Many schools began showing the clip of Alicia during assemblies, allowing students to witness the extraordinary journey of a woman once buried by prejudice, who stood up and claimed her identity. The image of her in flight gear, her sharp eyes behind the cockpit, intercut with scenes of her scrubbing floors in the barracks, fell silent the entire classroom. Teachers needed no explanation. The footage volume. In small classrooms and large auditoriums alike, Alicia's name became a living lesson in perseverance and justice. On school grounds, students buzzed excitedly after watching the clip. Many gasped, saying, "She was once a janitor, now a pilot." That simple statement carried the power of contrast, teaching the children that prejudice cannot define someone's destiny. A group of students engaged in a heated debate about how someone could endure 8 years in silence, only to emerge with such strength. One said her silence made her story all the more powerful. Another saw it as proof of resilience. Whatever the perspective, they all agreed that Alicia had changed how they understood courage. Teachers saw this as a valuable opportunity to educate students on human dignity. They encouraged students to write reflections after watching the video. Many of these heartfelt writings were displayed on bulletin board. One senior wrote, "Proved that strength doesn't lie in a broom but in the heart brave enough to face injustice." These sincere, youthful words were photographed and shared online, sparking a wave of new inspiration. Not only domestically, but international schools also began incorporating Alicia's story into lessons on justice and equality. Students worldwide encountered for the first time a woman of color who endured prejudice without letting it destroy her. Discussions emerged as children from diverse cultures agreed that a person's true worth is never tied to status or appearance. Alicia's name began to transcend borders, becoming a global lesson. Alicia followed these developments through news reports and the letters sent to her by students. Each scribbled note from those children felt like a healing balm for the wound she had carried so long. She understood that her story, although born in pain, had become a source of strength for an entire generation. Recognition was no longer confined to medals or headlines. It now came from the eager eyes of young students growing up with the belief justice may be delayed, but it can never be erased. And so, Alicia's journey did not end in the sky or at the podium. It continues to live on in every classroom and every story retold. The whispers of students, "She used to be a janitor, now she's a pilot," echo like a simple yet powerful song. A testament that one person can change not only her own destiny, but also how an entire generation views truth and pride. In a small classroom on the outskirts, as Alicia's clip ended, the room fell silent. Young eyes remained glued to the dark screen, as if her image was still etched into their mind. A black girl with neatly tied hair tilted her head and whispered to her neighbor, "I want to be like her too." That soft voice full of dreams echoed through the room loud enough for the teacher to smile. No lengthy explanation was needed. A child's simple words revealed the deep impact of Alicia's story. It stirred not only sorrow but also awakened hope, planting seeds for a new generation to believe that limits are not defined by race or background. That remark was shared by the teacher on social media, along with a photo of the girl sitting upright, her eyes shining bright. The post spread quickly, gaining hundreds of thousands of shares an hour. People were moved by the child's innocence, but even more by seeing how deeply Alicia's story had rooted in their heart. A child could recognize herself in a woman once dismissed, proves the boundless power of inspiration across generations, unadorned and as natural as breathing. From cities to rural areas, from modest schools to prestigious academies, the name Alicia Monroe echoed everywhere. Collective gatherings began to include topics fairness, bias, and how a person can rise from darkness to reclaim the light. In libraries, books about female pilots and veteran history were borrowed more than ever. On desks, students wrote down Alicia's words as life mottos. The influence had outgrown the clip. It became a wave nurturing belief. Many parents were swept up in that influence too. They told the story to their children at bedtime, not as a tragedy, but as courage and dignity can triumph. Many adults admitted they saw themselves in Alicia, having endured disrespect and discrimination at work or in society. Now, seeing a woman turn pain into strength gave them faith not to bow down again. Educational institutions and communities began centering Alicia's story in awareness campaigns. Posters, drawings, and short plays were inspired by her journey. Familiar images, her weathered fighter jet, the figure quietly holding a mop in the barrack, and the radiant smile on the day she was acknowledged, were recreated in diverse ways, making her story unforgettable. In some cities, scholarship programs were even named after Alicia to support students of color aspiring to careers in aviation. Her story spread like wildfire. No one could control it, nor would they want to put it out. That fire burned in students, parents, veterans, and even those who had never known the military. It not only ignited belief in justice, but also became a catalyst for society to look inward. People began to ask, how many others are living in silence like Alicia once did? How many dreams have been stifled by prejudice? Those questions drove change, prompting many organizations to pledge improvements so no talent would ever be forgotten again. For Alicia, reading about that little girl whispering her dream brought her to stillness for a long moment. She knew her life had been marked by losses that could not be erased, but now it was being redeemed by sowing hope in a new generation. She did not need more medals or praise, because the bright eyes of a child were proof enough. A relieved smile touched her lips, because she knew her story no longer belonged to her alone. It had become a shared treasure of the community. From that point on, whenever Alicia entered a classroom or auditorium, she was seen not just as a pilot veteran, but as a symbol of rising from the depths. And somewhere, in innocent eyes, there would still be girls whispering as they once did, "I want to be like her, too." It is those whispers that will keep the fire alive, ensuring Alicia Monroe's story lives forever in the hearts of a new generation. 1 year after the events that shook the nation, the name Alicia Monroe was no longer just a story told in classrooms or an inspirational figure on social media, but a living symbol. As the Air Force's major anniversary approached, the organizers decided to give Alicia a special role, an invitation to perform in the ceremony's aerial show. The moment the news broke, people across the country buzzed with excitement. Veterans smiled with pride, and the younger generation waited eagerly. The event would not simply be a display of technical skill, but a statement from an entire force that they had made amends, had learned to bow their heads in acknowledgement, and now honored true pride. On the day of the celebration, the sky was a clear blue, and crowds poured into the military base from early morning. Flags waved in the breeze, speakers blared upbeat tunes, and rows of spectators filled the square. On the honorary platform, Military and civilian officials sat in formality, but all eyes turned toward the runway, where everyone knew a special flight was about to begin. When the loudspeaker announced the name, Alicia Monroe, former combat pilot, the crowd erupted. Cheers and applause thundered like rising waves, echoing across the space, drowning out the marching band. Alicia emerged, wearing a crisp flight suit, walking firmly toward the gleaming, silver-toned fighter jet. Her boots struck the ground with steady force, showing no sign of the years she had been forced to live in silence. Veterans watching the moment grew emotional, knowing the harsh road she had taken to stand here today. Hundreds of phones were raised, capturing the image of a woman walking toward the sky like returning to an old home. As Alicia placed her hand on the aircraft's body, the crowd roared louder. It was more than applause, it was acknowledgement from thousands who stood witnessing it. She climbed the ladder, shiny rung catching the sunlight, and then settled into the cockpit. For a brief second, silence fell, as if the grandstand held its collective breath. She adjusted her straps, placed her hand on the controls, her eyes calm but blazing. In that moment, everyone knew she had returned to where she truly belonged. The engine roared to life, its growl shaking the air. Thousands of hearts pounded in rhythm with the spinning blade. The plane shuddered, and white smoke from the exhaust, signaling takeoff. The cheers rose again, children waved flags, and adults shouted her name. As the wheels lifted off the ground, the sky seemed to open wide, and the fighter jet soared upward, leaving behind a long trail of smoke like a proud stroke across the heaven. The audience tilted their heads upward, eyes locked on the aircraft dancing across the blue sky. Alicia wasn't just flying, she was commanding the plane with all the pride that had long been suppressed. Every roll, every dive, and sharp pull was executed with flawless precision. The cheers were relentless, mixed with gasps of awe as she performed daring maneuvers. Up there, no one saw a janitor who had been humiliated, only a true pilot, reclaiming her worth through the language of wing. Live broadcast cameras captured every second, streaming it across the country and beyond. In living rooms, cafes, and classrooms, millions watched, holding their breath through each loop, then erupting in cheers. As the plane steadied again, veterans sitting in front of screens couldn't hide their tears, because in that flight path, they saw a piece of themselves, a part of the truth society once tried to bury. In the stands, a little girl held up a handmade sign with crooked letters that read, "I want to be like." The photo was quickly taken, shared across social media, and became the symbol of the entire event. It captured the essence of that day, the power of inspiration passed from someone once disregarded to a new generation, growing up believing the sky belongs to them, too. When Alicia completed her final arc, the aircraft gently descended, wheels touching down to thunderous applause. She opened the cockpit, removed her helmet, and stepped out with composed grace. Thousands stood to greet her, the cheers echoing all the way down the runway. She raised her hand in salute, not to receive praise, but to affirm that she had returned not in the shadows, but exactly where she was always meant to be. The air show ended, but its resonance lingered. Headlines read, "The pilot returns to the sky." Television anchors commented that never before had a flight carried so many layers of meaning. It wasn't just aviation art, it was atonement, a declaration that prejudice had been defeated. In that sunset, as the aircraft rested on the runway, everyone knew Alicia Monroe's story would soar far beyond any flight. The jet surged upward again, the sky a vast canvas, and Alicia Monroe painted with the white smoke of her engine. She didn't choose flashy tricks, but guided the plane in smooth arc, looping gradually to form giant letters. As the trails crossed, the word "justice" appeared boldly in the sky, bright and powerful. Tens of thousands of eyes gazed upward, stunned by a moment that was both breathtaking and deeply meaningful. It wasn't just a technical display. It was a message from someone once buried under injustice, now using her own wings to right the crowd murmured across the stands. Young soldiers cheered, children waved flags wildly, and veterans nodded with misty eyes. Everyone understood that the word "justice" in the sky wasn't just for Alicia, but for all who had been forgotten, who had endured prejudice and silence. In that moment, the sky became the most just courtroom, where justice no longer lived on paper or in promises, but stood tall and visible to all. As the final letter was completed in smoke, Alicia banked the plane, a high-altitude salute. On the ground, the crowd burst into uproar. Thousands called her name in unison, the voices rising like ocean waves, echoing into the sky, blending with the roar of the engine. Alicia, Alicia, the chant rolled on without command, unprompted, united in shared belief. It was a moment when respect came not from orders or rank, but from the hearts of thousands. That sound swept beyond the base, live streamed over TV and social media. Families in front of screens joined in. In some neighborhoods, entire blocks stood and cheered. In schools, students crowded around projectors, shouting as if they stood in the vast square themselves. Screens across angles captured the smoke word, justice, flooding social feeds at lightning speed. In minutes, that image became the face of the event, accompanied by millions of praises. Many wrote that they had never seen justice depicted so vividly. One standout comment read, "Courts are slow and words are hollow. A pilot wrote in the sky what we all longed for." Thousands agreed, turning those words into quotes paired with the smoke writing against the sky. International media covered the event immediately, with major outlets headlining it as "Justice Performance in the Sky." In the stands, many could not hold back tears. Veterans who knew Alicia from the battlefield wiped their eyes, feeling that their comrade had done what none had dared, carved justice into the heavens for the world to witness. Young people saw a pledge in it that none of them would ever be left behind if they held to their belief. Cheers for Alicia lasted for many minutes, weaving with non-stop applause. As Alicia guided the plane back down, the chants continued. She made one more circuit over the stands. The plane tipped in salute, and the crowd immediately cheered louder. The energy of thousands resonating together made the ground seem to tremble. In the cockpit, Alicia heard each call, her lips pressed together, eyes glowing, because she knew she wasn't flying just for herself anymore, but soaring on behalf of all who had been forgotten. As the wheels touched down, the grandstand was still roaring. Signs bearing the words "Justice" and "Alicia" were held high, thousands of people crowding toward the barrier for a closer look at her face. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and within minutes, hundreds of photos flooded the internet. People praised not just the flying technique, but the way Alicia turned a flight display into a symbol, a movement in the sky into a declaration etched in memory. That moment marked a milestone, when justice was no longer a distant concept but a visible image, written in white smoke and in the echoed shouts of thousands. Alicia stepped out of the cockpit, raised her hand to greet the crowd, a calm smile on her lips. She knew this flight wasn't just to celebrate a holiday, but to affirm once more that truth, no matter how long it is buried, can still rise and shine, like the word justice still hanging in the sky today. After the days filled with dazzling glory, Alicia Monroe did not choose the path of fame or the powerful positions many had expected. She stepped away from the spotlight, living simply in a small house in the suburbs, tending a few flower beds out front, and taking morning walks down quiet roads to enjoy the fresh air. But that silence didn't mean she turned her back on the world. Instead of keeping the awards or funding for herself, Alicia decided to create a foundation dedicated to Black veterans, those who, like her, once struggled in silence. The fund was called Justice in Flight, built to provide financial support, mental health counseling, and job training for those who had worn the uniform but were forgotten when they came home. At the press conference announcing the fund, the room was small but warm, with no fireworks, no extravagance, just the faces of veterans who came to witness the moment. Alicia sat in the center, smiling as trembling but emotional hands gripped hers. She spoke briefly. "I don't want anyone to live 8 years in the dark like I did. This fund isn't just help. It's a reminder that they deserve to be heard." The room welled up with emotion because her words were simple but deeply sincere. A young reporter, eyes bright, asked, "What helped you get through all those years?" The room fell silent, waiting for the answer. Alicia looked up, her deep eyes reflecting all she had lived through. Her voice was steady, clear. "I made it through because of the memory of those who didn't, because I believed that if I stayed silent, their sacrifice would be buried too. I chose to live so I could keep flying, not for myself, but for them." The words hit straight into the hearts of those listening, leaving a silence that lingered before the room erupted. erupted in thunderous applause. Her answer was quickly quoted across major news outlets, appearing on front pages nationwide. People shared that Alicia's strength didn't lie in her faith, but in her ability to turn pain into purpose for others. Online forums lit up, with many writing, "This is how a true hero acts, not for applause, but to create a legacy." The words spread quickly, transforming Alicia's image from a brave woman into an enduring symbol of resilience and compassion. Veterans across the country began reaching out to the foundation, not only for support but to rediscover a sense of hope. Many shared that they had stayed silent for too long, but seeing Alicia gave them the courage to step out of the shadows. The fund's early programs focused on scholarships for veterans' children, helping the next generation move forward without the burden of prejudice. Every grant, every group session, left a lasting impact on the community. Alicia no longer sought the spotlight, but every step she took still left an echo. People remembered her not just as the pilot who wrote justice across the sky, but as the woman who chose to turn her victory into an opportunity for thousands of others. That legacy wasn't a medal on her chest, but the smiles of veterans who were helped, the dreams of Black children nurtured by the belief that the future belonged to them. And with every question from the press, every look of hope from the next generation, Alicia always held one simple answer: "I just want to make sure no one has to endure years of being forgotten like I did." When reporters pressed further, asking what had kept Alicia Monroe standing through the storm, she smiled, her eyes shining, and answered firmly, "Because I believe the truth never falls." That line echoed through the room, was printed on every news page, and shared across all social platforms. It wasn't a slogan, but the crystallization of 8 years of silence, 8 years of endurance, and finally, the moment when justice was revealed. Listeners felt that Alicia's words didn't come from blind optimism, but from bitter experience and faith tested to its limit. That's why they carried enough weight to touch millions of hearts, leading many to say it was a sentence meant to live on with time. The media immediately used that quote as a headline, calling it the perfect summary of Alicia's journey. Commentators wrote that she had turned pain into strength, truth into a guiding light. Schools printed the quote on posters and hung them in classrooms as a reminder to students of the value of perseverance. On social media, the hashtag #Truth Never Falls spread like wildfire, paired with Alicia's smiling image, becoming a global message about the power of truth. In a special photo session, organizers chose the old airbase where Alicia had once been mocked, and also where she had proven her worth. She stood in front of the fated fighter jet, one hand resting gently on its body. A photographer captured the moment, simple, powerful. No need for elaborate staging, no added embellishments, just Alicia in a calm stance, with the aircraft that had carried both her humiliation and her glory behind her. The photo quickly became the official image, closed the story, printed in newspapers, magazines, and even hung in aviation museums. People looked at that photo not just to remember a person, but to see a living symbol. Alicia was no longer just a former pilot or a janitor who had been dismissed, proof that the truth, once illuminated, will stand firm against any storm. Future generations, when looking at that image, will be reminded that justice can be delayed, but it cannot be erased. That is the legacy Alicia left behind, not in medals or praise, but in the unwavering belief passed from the past into the future. And so, the story closes not with promises or declarations, but with a simple image. A woman standing before a fighter jet, silent, proud. It encapsulates the entire journey, from the depths of humiliation to the heights of justice, from the broom in her hand to the trail of smoke that spelled justice across the sky. That image became a symbol, so that whenever Alicia Monroe is mentioned, people think not only of a person, but of the power of truth, something that never falls. When the image of Alicia Monroe standing before the fighter jet was chosen to conclude the journey, people finally felt the full weight of a story that had weathered countless storms. From the moment she held a broom in the military warehouse, mocked and dismissed, to the moment she stepped into the light as a fighter pilot recognized worldwide, it was more than a reversal of, it was proof that truth always finds its way to rise. That path was never paved in roses, it was lined with humiliation, neglect, and long nights of torment, but it was her resolve that turned Alicia into a symbol. Her story didn't end at proving she could fly a fighter jet or restoring her personal honor. It became evident that a system, when guided by prejudice, crush a person, but also that when justice is fueled by truth and public outcry, it can force an entire power structure to bow. Alicia didn't win through vengeance, but by showing the world the truth that had been buried for 8 years. That was a lasting victory, because it didn't belong to her alone, it belonged to everyone who had ever been forgotten. What made this journey extraordinary was its reach beyond the individual. From the first clips of her flying, to the chants of Alicia, from thousands on the ground, to the word justice she wrote in the sky, every detail helped shape her into a collective symbol. The public didn't just witness her story, they became part of it, helping to pull the truth out of the shadows and return to Alicia the recognition she deserved. One of the most powerful moments came when Alicia explained why she had stayed silent for 8 years. It wasn't weakness, but the result of psychological pain after the war and a system that turned its back. The fact that someone who once led a squadron had to live in the shadows with a broom showed how injustice can break anyone, even heroes. Yet it was in that quiet, hidden place that she proved pride can't be stripped away. It can be buried in dust, but it will ignite when the time comes. The fact that she preserved her dignity in silence, only to shine when it mattered most, gave her story meaning beyond personal triumph. It taught people how to stand firm even when the world turns away. From Alicia's journey, first lesson is the value of justice. Justice may come late, but when a community demands it with one voice, it arrived. The rise of public opinion, the media, social networks, and finally the actions of those in power showed that collective strength cannot be ignored. People may cover up, may excuse wrongdoing with the word joke, but when the truth is exposed, every shield collapses. Justice doesn't come from begging, it comes from the resolve of those who hold the truth, and the pressure from those who support what is right. The second lesson is the power of truth. Alicia said she survived because she believed that truth never falls. That statement became a compass for millions. Truth may be buried for a long time, but it doesn't disappear, and when revealed, it has the power to heal, awaken, and change society. In a world full of distorted stories, Alicia's resolve is a reminder that truth is the only foundation on which justice can stand. The third lesson comes from the legacy Alicia left behind. She didn't keep the spotlight for herself, but chose to launch Justice in Flight Fund to support Black veterans. This shows that a true victory is not about being honored, but about turning triumph into an opportunity for others. By using her story to open doors for many, Alicia proved that a hero's legacy lies not in medals, but in the change they bring to their community. It must also be emphasized that the lesson from Alicia isn't just for those in the military or those who've prejudice. It's for anyone who has ever felt dismissed, pushed into a corner. The story reminds us that the true worth of a person is not defined by social position or how others see them, but by the resolve to stay true to oneself. Alicia spent 8 years as a janitor, but in every quiet step, she carried the pride of a pilot in her heart. When the moment came, pride ignited and shook the world. Finally, the most important lesson is belief in the next generation. When a little black girl whispered, "I want to be like her," it wasn't just admiration, it was continuation. Alicia's story planted seeds for new dreams, so the next generation will no longer fear prejudice, no longer stay silent in the face of injustice. That's what makes her a living symbol, because a real symbol isn't just admired, it inspires action. Looking back at the entire journey, from the insults in the mess hall to the rolls in the sky, from the tear-filled hearing to the moment justice was written above the clouds, we see the unbroken thread of a story not told for entertainment, but to awaken. Alicia Monroe gave the world more than a memory, she left behind a living legacy. The belief that justice may be delayed, but it will arrive, that truth may be buried, but it will stand firm, and that a person, even Prejudice, can rise to become an enduring symbol. The story's ending isn't a period, but an ellipsis, because every time the image of Alicia standing before her fighter jet appears, it reminds us that there are still voices waiting to be heard, still silent heroes, yet to be recognized. And it is the very existence of this symbol that will keep pushing the world to seek the truth, so that justice is no longer a distant dream, but a lived reality in the life of every human being.